On the surface, I once bought a forest. The parasites claimed that the land belonged to God and demanded that I establish a public park there. Why? So the rebel would stand slack-jawed under the canopy and pretend that it was paradise earned. When Congress moved to nationalize my forest, I burnt it to the ground. God did not plant the seeds of this Arcadia. I did.
Do you remember your first experience with BioShock? Do you remember the unnaturally large moon illuminating the lighthouse in the middle of the Atlantic, as if trying to suppress the advancing darkness and its desire to swallow the lit space from all sides and reclaim it into its own domain? And at the center of such a setting, do you recall the magnificent bust of Andrew Ryan gazing from above within the sculpted interior of the lighthouse as a substitute for the moon outside, bearing witness to humanity's struggle against the forces of nature and reflecting the contest between moonlight and darkness? In the middle of nothing, something, a product of human ingenuity, skill, and effort. In the middle of nothing, a sequence stretching from the light of the heavens through the human form to the thought that defines this world. No gods or kings, only man. And moving forward, the three spheres of human endeavor upon which what lies before us is built: industry, science, and art, like a funnel, ensuring that all that is good upon the earthly sphere flows toward a settlement that, at first glance alone, justifies the grandeur of its own name: Rapture. Oh, what a setup! What mystery in weaving the environment and story! For it is precisely after such brilliance that you least expect to be met with ruin, death, fear, and madness. And yet, that is exactly what lies at the bottom of the sea, echoing the fate that Ayn Rand attributes to the so-called altruists in her novel Atlas Shrugged. And although the creator of Rapture embraces principles of life grounded in the ideas of the virtue of selfishness, the result diverges from the vision, and the inevitability of decay and rust is revealed in the rotating beam of light and its reflection upon the BioShock inscription. From the hope of dawn through the brilliance of noon to the frailty of dusk, all in hurried motion. Yet the game is not a mere inversion of narrative. Its authors demonstrate a mastery and intellectual honesty rarely found in Rand. They acknowledge the greatness of their ideological opponents and enter into debate with giants, not clowns, earning from the very first step the respect of serious interlocutors. Evidence of this lies, among other things, in the fact that BioShock has drawn the attention of the academic world and sparked rich discussion on a range of questions woven into the virtual spaces of its underwater utopia. Thus, unlike Warcraft and Stalker, which we've covered in previous videos, BioShock is accompanied by literature and content more directly tied to the philosophical themes explored within the game. Now, would you kindly subscribe and take a deep breath, because a long journey awaits us, from the foundations of objectivism, through Ryan's utopia to Atlas and Jack. Bear with me, as we must first dissect Rand's ideas and then slowly move to Rapture. It is time to take a deep dive. Who is Atlas? In the enchanting light of Arcadia, the proud figure of a man depicted on the poster seemed to reflect an added shade of extraordinariness. The words were written simply, mirroring the character of the clothing that covered the heroic figure. The promising freedom and peace of the pastoral expanses illustrated above the poster appeared to draw the gaze of the unknown hero, bearing witness to his intention to turn this paradise on earth into reality. Yet there was no direct answer to the question posed. The poster simply stood there, like a note to the protagonist that, in the underwater grove, a reflection on the question of exceptionality awaited him. As though within the pollen-filled air that entices and awakens longing, there lies a truth that cannot be grasped directly, but only through the actions of those who commissioned the forest. But after the poisonous fumes fill the space, and the full force of awareness strikes, revealing the consequences of commodifying oxygen, the player is reminded that every utopia has its dark side, and that relying on the reason or will of its creator regardless of his exceptionalism, is not the wisest life strategy. It is quite clear that the narrative of BioShock and Rapture is shaped by the life and work of the writer Ayn Rand, her objectivist philosophy, and the novels Atlas Shrugged and The Fountainhead. However, the ways in which her writings are woven into the world of the game are not always obvious, and the aforementioned question testifies to this. On a surface level, it certainly serves as an allusion to the question, "Who is John Galt?" with which Atlas Shrugged begins, but its depth does not end there. Unlike the often shallow associations Rand employs in constructing her characters and novels, the authors of BioShock use this to point toward the many nuances that color the game. Beyond the stated parallel, as we will attempt to show, several layers can be identified, ones that examine both the nature of her ideas and the way she employs existing concepts. On the first level, the matter can be understood in the most literal sense. That is, we must ask whether we, like Rand, truly grasp the essence of the myth of Atlas. For one might think it concerns an extraordinary figure deserving of our respect, perhaps even worship. However, while the first part of this claim cannot be disputed since he is indeed a titan, both in mythological and metaphorical sense, the rest of the statement is more than questionable. This is of essential importance because anyone who has read Ayn Rand could observe her tendency to assign new meanings to established myths and even concepts, meanings that function only within the world she created for herself and her like-minded followers, and which others would have good reason to question. A second ambiguity that can be read from this poster based on what the game itself presents is this: who truly serves as the motor of the world? Is it really the representatives of big capital, exceptional scientists freed from the constraints of petty morality, or perhaps charismatic con artists capable of mobilizing the masses? Could it be the faceless titans clad in diving suits, in constant motion to maintain the structures from which Rapture is built? And in the end, is Atlas perhaps being confused with Hercules, an exceptional man who only manages to overcome trials through cooperation with a wide array of others? The third framework from which the question of the poster may be viewed reflects the spirit in which it is posed in the novel, a spirit captured by Dagny Taggart, its protagonist.
She heard in her mind, as her mockery at fate, as her cry of defiance, the words of the sentence she hated, the words of defeat, of despair, and of a plea for help.
For, as the novel shows, it is not a question meant to be answered. It is a rhetorical expression of surrender, the equivalent of our "who knows." Yet we may frame it differently, though still as a form of surrender. If we accept her premise and proceed from the idea that Atlas is an adequate metaphor for excellence, rationality, strength, and productivity, then what remains is to ask, who truly possesses the capacity to achieve such an ideal? And do the inherent weaknesses of our being and mind prevent us from becoming the unbreakable, rational titans of Rand's imagination? Ultimately, do we even wish to become that, and does such an ideal amount to an abandonment of our humanity? All this and much more is contained within the scenes of the utopia at the bottom of the ocean. But to understand it, we must return to the foundations, to Ayn Rand's ideas and their reflection within the game. And for that, nothing serves us better than the character and thought of Andrew Ryan. By examining his life from his origins through his rise in the United States to the statements delivered in monologues or dialogues preserved in audio logs scattered throughout Rapture or encountered through direct radio contact with him, we can piece together a picture both of the foundations of objectivism and of the flaws within that philosophy. His character also encapsulates the aesthetic and the admiration with which Rand fashions her heroes, so that the very beginning of the game, through the aforementioned bust that greets us, serves as a proof of the creator's dedication to the source material, as well as a reflection of a passage from Atlas Shrugged, in which the author contrasts the face of the heroine with the grandeur of the city behind her.
This is the world and the core of it. This is what made the city. They go together. The angular shapes of the buildings and the angular lines of a face, stripped of everything but purpose. The rising steps of steel and the steps of a being intent upon his goal. This is what they had been. All the men who had lived to invent the lights, the steel, the furnaces, the motors. They were the world. They. Not the men who crouched in dark corners, half begging, half threatening, boastfully displaying their open sores as their only claim on life and virtue.
Ultimately, through his story we also gain a broader picture of the at least partial conditioning of the individual by socio-historical circumstances, the spirit of the times, and even hostility towards certain ideas, that is, everything Ayn Rand tends to overlook. In time, we arrive at the conclusion that negative identification often leads to imitation, albeit with an opposite sign. But let us proceed slowly, beginning with the snowbound expenses of revolutionary Russia. Andrew Ryan and Ayn Rand not only have similar-sounding names, but are both of Russian origin, initially named Andrei Ryanovsky and Alisa Zinovievna Rosenbaum, respectively. If we were to view Ryan's name in its English form as an anagram, a rearrangement of its letters would reveal the message "We are Ayn Rand," though it should be noted that Ken Levine, the lead developer of the game, did not notice this until after its release. Be that as it may, following the thread of the writer's life, Ryan's youth is tied to the blue skies and harsh winds of the first communist paradise, from which he flees together with his father, exposed to poverty, to the ostracism of his own father, and to the brutality of the new authorities whose soldiers did not hesitate to serve justice or maintain order through the ruthless removal of the undesirable. He develops from an early age a hostility toward communism, but also more generally toward the force of the state or the masses. It is precisely such circumstances that are woven into the soul and character of the future American magnate, who will embed his exceptionalism into the very foundations of the underwater utopia. From the very beginning, we see that in developing the narrative of Ryan's uniqueness, the creators of the game nonetheless present a broader context that leaves its mark on the figure of the great man. Thus, already at this level, they demonstrate more sense, honesty, and even style than Ayn Rand. And to understand this, we must pause and turn to an intriguing sentence found in the appendix to Atlas Shrugged, written in the author's own hand. The only philosophical depth I can acknowledge is to Aristotle. Such a statement is quite astonishing, yet it is evident that this idea, along with the confidence with which it is expressed, is woven into the central characters of her novels. Through John Galt's monologues and his reflections on the so-called law of identity, as well as through the titles of the three parts of the book, we can see her homage to the Greek sage. However, when we attempt to examine the remainder, what should pertain to the origins of certain beliefs, the path leading to their formation, as well as potential obstacles or blessings, we find that there is, in fact, nothing there, neither in the protagonists of the novel, nor in the author herself. As if driven by some inner force that aligns perfectly with an objective external reality, their worldview and characters are simply given. Francisco d'Anconia, Hank Rearden, Dagny Taggart, or John Galt, the heroes of Atlas Shrugged, each and every one knows that they do not belong to the intellectual corruption of the world in which they find themselves, and that they have always been this way. Their thoughts, it seems, are self-created. A clear artistic expression of this can be found in the description of the works of Howard Rourke, the protagonist of The Fountainhead, as revealed in the following quote.
They were sketches of buildings such as had never stood on the face of the earth. They were as the first houses built by the first man born, who had never heard of others building before him. There was nothing to be said of them, except that each structure was inevitably what it had to be. It was not as if the draftsman had sat over them, pondering laboriously, piecing together doors, windows, and columns, as his whim dictated and as the books prescribed. It was as if the buildings had sprung from the earth and from some living force, complete, unalterably right. The hand that had made the sharp pencil lines still had much to learn, but not a line seemed superfluous, not a needed plane was missing. The structures were austere and simple, until one looked at them and realized what work, what complexity of method, what tension of thought had achieved the simplicity. No laws had dictated a single detail. The buildings were not classical, they were not Gothic, they were not Renaissance. They were only Howard Rourke.
Thus, self-created thought, true originality and the heroism of the exceptional, unrepeatable individual radiate from this source. Buildings that rise from the ground stand as reflections of Rourke's mind, vibrating at the same frequencies as an unyielding reality, freed from the constraints of all the thoughts and deeds of the vast masses that preceded him. Only he, his mind, and reality that is evident to him. The author affirms the same conviction regarding her own ideas in multiple places through statements such as, "I have always lived by the philosophy I present in my books," or "I have held the same philosophy I now hold for as far back as I can remember." And nothing changes when we look at other media. Thus, in response to journalist Mike Wallace's question about where her ideas come from, she confidently states, "Out of my own mind, with the sole acknowledgement of a debt to Aristotle, who is the only philosopher who ever influenced me. I devised the rest of my philosophy myself." It would seem that her entire life is to be viewed as the logical unwinding of an ideational philosophical skein given at birth. Now, think about your own life, the paths you have walked, the challenges you have faced, and the blessings that have given you an advantage over others. What would you single out as the decisive influence that shaped both your life and your worldview? Was it your parents' decision to send you to a particular kindergarten or school, where you met friends, some of whom displayed remarkable qualities even at that age? Was it a chance encounter with a man or woman of your life who introduced you to a branch of literature or science you had never known? Was it an unfair university professor who was unable to separate personal ideological convictions from the profession he had chosen, thereby shaping your perception of all representatives of that ideology based on mental shortcuts that operate beyond an individual's will and form the basis of prejudice? Whatever you choose, one truth remains. Such a vision is a result of fitting a sea of details into a structured narrative about your own origins, one that seeks to interpret reality while coloring it with personal biases, irrationalities, emotions, and desires. Therefore, there is nothing for you to admit or not admit regarding such influences. Reality exists independently of you, and your relationship to it is mediated by deeply flawed tools, human senses and the mind, a topic to which we will return later. What you can do is become aware of certain aspects of your intellectual development. Thus, we can already state, and will demonstrate over time, that Ayn Rand's philosophy, as well as the success she achieved in the United States, is a consequence of the circumstances in which she found herself, certainly alongside the virtues and flaws that defined her, the effort she invested, her abilities to seize opportunities, and the luck that followed her. From this, it becomes clear that a view of the intellectual genesis of any individual, such as the one presented by the aforementioned author, is, to put it mildly, misguided given several evident facts. First, philosophical inspiration is not always obvious. It is clear that we are inclined to construct narratives about the origin and grounding of our ideas, yet we must remain aware of indirect and less visible influences, those tied to parents, friends, teachers, debaters from radio or television programs, as well as professional or artistic books that leave a mark on our worldview, even if we would not think to list them among the works that shaped us, or perhaps even among those we have read. The second point concerns negative formation, that is, the development of one's own principles in response to ideas or behaviors with which we disagree or perceive as hostile. It is not uncommon for the thorough elaboration of a worldview by someone we oppose to help us, by contrast, come to understand our own world and build our own identity. Just consider how academic literature or political divisions function. Observe the continuity tied both to elaboration and refinement and to the questioning or rejection of others' findings, arguments, and ideas, through which a new system emerges within a complex network of inquiry or reflection. Not only is there constant communication with those who live in the same period as we do, and recalibration based on it, but each of us is also in interaction with those who existed in the ages of old, as well as with those who may yet appear. We think by building upon our predecessors, but we also consider the consequences for those who will come after us, and their potential reactions. It is precisely this breadth of branching awareness that makes a human being human. Moreover, Ayn Rand herself testifies, through her own example, to the existence of a negative source of inspiration, though she would likely never formulate it in such terms. In her 1945 letters to readers of The Fountainhead, she clearly states, "I decided to be a writer at the age of 9. It was a specific, conscious decision. I remember the day and the hour. I did not start by trying to describe the folk next door, but by inventing people who did things the folk next door would never do. I could summon no interest or enthusiasm for people as they are, when I had in my mind a blinding picture of people as they could be." Finally, one more thing should be mentioned, something we do not consider often enough, and that is the linguistic conditioning of our perception of phenomena. Without delving too deeply into this topic, it is worth noting that there are theories suggesting that it is precisely the system of concepts along with the meanings attached to them, laden with rich layers of philosophical assumptions, that shapes the way we comprehend reality. Although reality exists independently of our beliefs, our relationship to it is mediated, among other things, through the concepts we construct about it. Thus, even at this level, there is a form of conditioning by something produced by others, over which we had no influence whatsoever, an idea discussed by Wittgenstein, Foucault, and even Orwell through the concept of newspeak. Taking all of this into account, the notion that Ayn Rand or anyone else can acknowledge influence, let alone reduce it to a single individual, is entirely absurd. Such a perception of self-creation, as presented in her works, does not go beyond the level of a child who, in a surge of hormones, claims that no one understands them. This does not in any way negate the role of originality, effort, exceptional ability, and personal achievement, but none of these exist in a vacuum. A human being is never a blank slate, because even at birth, the capacities and potentials they carry are shaped by a vast sea of information, synthesized through oceans of experience in an unbroken evolutionary march. And if we speak of transforming the potential of humanity, that which we inherit biologically, into the realization of humanity, that which, in accordance with the spirit of the times, we consider a civilizational achievement to be instilled in each of us, from language and education through the acceptance of laws to certain behavioral patterns in interaction with others, then it becomes clear that a human being is a slate upon which many have written, both masters and charlatans. This excursion into a debate about an apparently trivial sentence actually serves a crucial purpose, as it illuminates the essence of Ayn Rand's life and work. This is key to understanding the nature of the game's narrative, namely that it is not an attempt to distort her ideas or unjustifiably attach ruin to her utopia, but rather to point to the inevitability of such an outcome precisely because of the assumptions on which it is built. It seems that by influence or inspiration, Rand refers only to those elements she consciously incorporates into her philosophy, a questionable assumption to say the least. Revisiting the statement made during her interview with Mike Wallace leads to the conclusion that ideas matter only insofar as we rationally embrace them, while latent cultural influences are deemed irrelevant, as is the broader spirit of the times, and that rejecting a thinker's worldview carries no form of intellectual depth. Let us consider this without complex terminology. Imagine yourself lost in a dense forest, faced with numerous paths you might choose. Now, imagine that in the distance you see a dead person lying on one of those possible paths, and you decide to take the opposite direction. Would anyone in the right mind deny that the dead person, through a choice you only witnessed indirectly, influenced you? Because upon seeing the danger of death, you chose not to follow the path he took, nor to expose yourself to the same fate. Could anyone claim that his choice and the fate that befell him did not shape your perception of the correct path? And finally, using this metaphor, would one conclude that influence can only be acknowledged in the case of a potential guide, whom you did not even choose to follow through the forest but merely encountered along the path you had already taken, which served as a proof of the correctness of the direction he took. Confusing, isn't it? This leads us to an important distinction, the opposition between what we might call rationally processed and accepted influence and causal or structural influence, which will help us understand such a significant oversight the creator of objectivism made. In the first case, what matters are reasons, that is, answers to questions such as which ideas you accept as true, which intellectuals you recognize as bearers of truth, or whose arguments you see as aligned with your own beliefs. From that perspective, if Aristotle influences Rand, it means that she accepts his fundamental premises because she herself has arrived at the same conclusions, sees his arguments as consistent with her worldview, and grants him philosophical authority because his conclusions align with truth and have helped her further strengthen her own arguments. On the other hand, there are causal influences, the causal chain, where what matters are questions of origin and formation. What has shaped the way you think? Which problems do you recognize as most important and why? Which solutions are you even capable of conceiving as possible? From this perspective, an intellectual influences you when he defines the questions that prompt you to seek answers, structures the intellectual field through which you move, and points out metaphorical dead ends you choose to avoid. The first type of influence thus concerns the conscious reflection and acceptance of certain beliefs, while the second testifies to the historical and conceptual frameworks within which those beliefs are formed. Therefore, rejecting a particular worldview cannot negate its influence on the structure of your inquiry and reflection, because even if its creator was wrong, that very mistake has shown you where not to look. To shed light on all the above, we may turn to the relationship our heroine develops toward the arch-villain of the objectivist school, Immanuel Kant. In The Objectivist, speaking about a text by Leonard Peikoff about this thinker, Rand explicitly states, "I say that Kant is the most evil man in mankind's history, and that he is the enemy I am fighting and have been fighting all these years." This is not rhetorical, but literal. The author believes that Kant severed reason from reality, undermined humanity's ability to know it, and thereby paved the way for collectivism, subjectivism, and tyranny. Thus, for her, he does not appear as just another philosopher who erred in his thinking, but as a force of evil that ruined the world and against which she constructs her own. In this respect, it is clear that we are dealing with a massive causal influence, as previously described, because without his ideas she could not have articulated her own philosophy, treating them as a branching point at which Western civilization took a wrong turn, one she seeks to correct, even as she maintained that he did not influence her. Why is this so? Why would she deny this kind of inspiration? Because acknowledging negative influence would undermine the foundations of her philosophy. The system she constructs ties intellectual independence, moral virtue, and epistemic authority together, and the recognition of negative influence would weaken or dismantle these notions by illuminating the historical conditioning of individual thought, the fact that rejected ideas still shape how we think, at the very least as boundaries that mark false paths, and that originality does not emerge from nothing. This, in turn, would dismantle her moralizing view of independence, her sharp division between villains and heroes in intellectual history, and her heroic self-image built upon the untenable notion that she single-handedly rediscovered reason. This last point is not an exaggeration, because if, as Rand claims, reason was gradually abandoned after Aristotle, only to be removed entirely from ethics by Kant, then it is clear that the implication is that she herself restored this worldview, that she rediscovered reason. All of this becomes particularly ironic when we consider that Aristotle never denied what she denies. He was aware that the errors of predecessors are productive within the sum of human thought, that the wrong path indirectly reveals much about the right one, and that philosophy is cumulative even when it is critical. Thus, by the standards of the only philosopher whose influence she acknowledges, one could argue that Kant shaped her even more than those she openly admires. At this point, the reason for emphasizing Andrew Ryan's experience with the Bolsheviks becomes clearer, as something extraordinarily important for understanding BioShock, as well as the decisive elements of Ayn Rand's own life experience and even the social conditions that characterized the United States during her lifetime, which enabled her to attain a level of influence that is difficult to imagine she would have achieved in a different world. Namely, Alisa Zinovievna witnessed the Bolshevik authorities seize her father's property, heard the gunfire of revolution in the streets of St. Petersburg, and felt fear for her life and the lives of her family members following her anti-communist outbursts in student debates. Seizing the opportunity to leave the country, she did so, never to return. But the mark of hatred toward the Reds remained. Nothing testifies to this more clearly than the fact that she took part in the hearings organized by the House Un-American Activities Committee, an investigative body concerned with alleged disloyalty and subversive activities of citizens, government officials, or organizations suspected of ties to Nazis or communists. She was questioned on October 20, 1947, as part of an inquiry into alleged communist propaganda in Hollywood, thereby becoming a part of a system that would result in the banning or boycotting of major figures in the film industry, such as Charlie Chaplin, Orson Welles, and Dalton Trumbo. Of course, her role and significance should not be overstated, but rather understood within a broader context. Some of her disciples frame this action as one of justice-seeking, yet this does not change the essence. Ayn Rand aligned herself with a form of state inquisition and contributed to the suppression of civil rights, as well as freedom of expression and thought. It is entirely irrelevant whether she did so because of her experiences with communists in the USSR or out of jealousy toward more talented individuals. The outcome is the same. At this point, one might invoke Karl Popper's explanation of the paradox of tolerance, the idea that a truly tolerant society must retain the right to be intolerant toward the intolerant, lest the intolerant eventually prevail. However, while the principle itself is clear, I do not believe it applies in the case of Ayn Rand's testimony. She was not fighting against intolerance, rather, she participated in a state-led prosecution of alleged or actual sympathizers of Red Russia or communism. Moreover, to the best of my knowledge, there is no evidence that those targeted were themselves intolerant, unless, in the spirit of meme culture stereotypes about Americans, we consider healthcare and efforts to prevent people from dying in the streets from various diseases to be some form of intolerance or red terror. Indeed, one could even view the writer herself through this lens, as suggested by the self-praise of the protagonist of The Fountainhead.
I've never been broad-minded.
Be that as it may, the very existence of such investigative bodies goes a long way toward explaining the success Rand achieved in the United States. In the heated struggle against the fog from the East, the black and white world of her novels, devoid of moral dilemmas, self-questioning, and meaningful debate, offered easily digestible propagandistic material. Her success is inseparable from the Cold War climate, anti-collectivism, anti-communism, and a radical propagandistic individualism. Having said that, it is worth emphasizing that there is one important difference between Rand and Ryan. As we see in the introduction of the book on the creation of Rapture, unlike Ayn, who defended the morality of using atomic weapons against Japan, Ryan was horrified by the nuclear mushroom cloud and the cries of thousands killed in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. His hostility toward Franklin Delano Roosevelt or Harry S. Truman was no less than that which he harbored toward the Red Tsar. In that respect, his character is, at least on this level, portrayed as significantly more moral and consistent than the aforementioned philosopher. He viewed the destructive power of the state as a principal evil, regardless of the flag or anthem. Such choice reflects the creator's intention to avoid presenting a simplistic view of objectivism, and instead, by crafting a towering human figure as its central character, to demonstrate why this ideology, not philosophy, is deeply flawed regardless of its bearer. Of course, this was also enabled by the unbounded field of imagination, allowing Ryan to free himself entirely from territories constrained by political economic systems and descend into the depths of the sea. To those curiosities from the life of the founder of Objectivism, we may add another, her view of the fate of the Native American population. In her 1974 speech at West Point before graduating cadets of the U.S. Military Academy, Rand stated, "I do not think that they had any right to live in a country merely because they were born here and acted and lived like savages. Americans didn't conquer. Americans did not conquer this country," adding that any white person who brings the element of civilization has the right to take over this country. She further justifies her view by pointing to the absence of a concept of property rights among the native population, as well as to the fact that they've accepted agreements with settlers, voluntarily exchanging land for various trivial goods, only to later take up arms dissatisfied with the exchange, though, we might say, after realizing that they've been deceived. Once again, reflecting on the absurd notion of intellectual self-creation, we can here point to a clear continuity with all colonial narratives in which, in various forms, the burden of the white man was invoked. Although it should be acknowledged that she regarded racism as the lowest form of collectivism, the outcomes of her thought do not differ significantly from it. If it is not cloaked in the language of white supremacy, it appears in the equivalent of the German Zivilisierungsmission, which was hardly foreign to Britain or France. Let us consider what the Serbian sociologist Mirko Kosic recorded in his book Modern Germany. He provides the words of the University of Vienna professor Ernst Haeckel, reflecting his vision of the German mission. The work of the German people in the development of culture and civilization gives the German people the right to occupy the Balkans, Asia Minor, Syria, and Mesopotamia, and to displace the currently weak and incapable races from them. Remove the term races, and there it is. None of the above appeared in our analysis without reason, nor should it surprise us. The prosecution of dissenters, the use of atomic weapons against civilians, or the expulsion and perhaps even the massacre of civilization-defective peoples are all seasoned by an unconscious slide into the collectivization of responsibility. For what else could be the meaning behind the idea that it is justified to raze Hiroshima to the ground, regardless of the victims, since there are no innocents in war? Does this also include the Japanese infants in cradles? And if it is so, if a population chooses its government and must bear responsibility for its actions, is she then also culpable for the evils committed by the communists across the Soviet Union simply because she did not fight against them? All of this clearly demonstrates that she is not a representative of liberty-oriented thought, but rather a radical whose understanding of social reality and morality stems from superficial beliefs about intellectual influence, reason, or independence that we mentioned earlier, each more erroneous than the previous one. And now, finally, we can turn to the essence, the consequences that Ayn Rand's philosophical assumptions had on her creative work and the ways in which these were integrated into the narrative of the video game. The parallels with the life and positions of the author we have drawn in the preceding passages illuminate this to a large extent, and we will aim to show that these do not represent deviations from her worldview, but rather direct consequences of it. On the other hand, even though in the case of Andrew Ryan we initially do not observe any of the three problematic elements of Ayn Rand's public conduct, persecution of artists, justification of atomic weapons, or treating indigenous peoples as savages without the right to complain, he nonetheless carried enough toxic assumptions with him to the ocean floor, embedding in the pearly foundations of his underwater utopia a time bomb from which equivalent attitudes and decisions would inevitably emerge. However, before we proceed to address this topic, I must add a few things. Namely, I do not consider that Ayn Rand erred in everything, nor that her novels should be avoided. On the contrary, I greatly appreciate her emphasis on individual responsibility, her critique of hiding behind the collective, her debating zeal, her insistence on fighting for as long as it is possible, as well as her praise of persistence in truth regardless of the number of dissenters arrayed against one. I would also add that behind the thick wall of repeating the same essence in different contexts and her omnipresent melodrama, Her books contain segments marked by exceptional aesthetic quality, authorial fervor, and intensity rarely found elsewhere. These are all qualities I believe can inspire many, help them get moving, or overcome disencouragement. However, none of this implies that it would be wise to structure a community based on the principles of objectivism. Of course, her defense can be supported by the fact that she did not take anyone's life, but we must remember that neither did Marx, whose 18th Grimoire is an extraordinarily aesthetic text and whose intellect and talent far exceed those of Ayn Rand. Yet none of this renders his ideas inherently correct. Indeed, Rand may not have intended to transform her utopia into reality, writing primarily to depict the ideal human or for the sake of writing itself, but her name has entered the realms of politics and the NGO sector, where fantasy can easily mix with ambitions for power and social engineering. This danger is not mitigated by the fact that contemporary successors of her school, such as Don Watkins or Yaron Brook, have dramatically altered the approach, maintaining an unproblematic insistence on freedom, opportunity, talent, or knowledge, while discarding notions of self-creation, accusations of parasitism, and general disdain for others. To better illustrate the corruptive power of authority and the ease with which an idealistic narrative can be developed before its real-world adoption, we can look at the quote from a famous socialist criticizing the heightened authoritarianism of the nascent Soviet Union. There are two methods, the method of coercion, the military method, and the method of persuasion, the trade union method. A group of party workers headed by Trotsky, intoxicated by the successes achieved by military methods in the army, supposes that those methods can and must be adopted among the workers in order to achieve similar successes in strengthening the unions and in reviving industry. Soviet power must enjoy the firm confidence of the working class, for such a country can be directed only through the medium of the working class. Obviously, it is impossible to do this by coercive methods. Obviously, only normal methods of proletarian democracy in the unions, only methods of persuasion can make it possible to unite the working class, to stimulate its independent activity and strengthen its confidence in the Soviet power. The name of this socialist was Josif Vissarionovich Djugashvili, Stalin. True wisdom and intellectual excellence consist in recognizing danger before things go wrong. What Dostoyevsky's evil spirits were to leftist totalitarianism, BioShock is to objectivism. From a European perspective, Ayn Rand is a marginal figure whose existence might hardly be known were it not for significant investment in NGOs promoting her thought. Yet, the game seems to serve as a more than relevant warning to the United States, where there is a tendency to mythologize her persona and works, such as the claim that Atlas Shrugged is the second most influential book in the United States after the Bible. Any arguments that BioShock is merely a fantasy can be challenged with Rand's own words found in the appendix of Atlas Shrugged. I trust that no one will tell me that men such as I write about don't exist. That this book has been written and published is my proof that they do. Let's look at how the game's authors envisioned her utopia. It's worth reiterating that everything we recognize as problematic in Ayn Rand, of which more is to come, is not the result of a deviation from the ideas she advocated, but precisely a product of those ideas. The notion of rational processing and acceptance of influence as the only relevant one actually establishes the connection between human intellect, independence, and virtue. Intellect is a virtue when a person rationally strives to achieve their own goals and reaches the truth independently. Since, in her view, rationalism necessarily leads to the recognition of objective reality as it is, that is, the knowledge of truth is a necessary consequence of using reason, it is clear that the question cannot have multiple answers, especially not contradictory ones, because there cannot be multiple truths or multiple objective realities. And not only can there not be multiple truths, but the existence of contradictions is also impossible to accept, as Francisco d'Anconia summarizes in his reply to Dagny Taggart.
I'll give you a hint. Contradictions do not exist. Whenever you think that you are facing a contradiction, check your premises. You will find that one of them is wrong.
Someone must be wrong, and if behavior is based on incorrect conclusions, then it is clear based on the described connection that it moves from the realm of virtue into the realm of immorality. Such behavior is either the result of an inability to grasp the truth, which does not excuse the actor, or it is the consequence of conscious falsification of reality that is of inherent evil. Do you now see the connection with the content of the previous chapter? Unconscious immorality is savagery, as she sees it among Native Americans, which can only be purified by the noble hand of rational civilizers. Conscious immorality is evil, as embodied in her texts by Immanuel Kant or the allegedly read Hollywood. There is no need here to question the correctness of Kant's ideas or engage in similar debates, because what matters for us is simply to highlight the impossibility for her dissenters to be anything more than one of the two categories mentioned. BioShock actually raises the question of how such a worldview manifests in a world intertwined with the levers of power and authority, which is highly relevant given the noted influence of objectivist elements in political struggle. Precisely in the speech about the Great Chain, Andrew Ryan demonstrates this logic, that is, the conviction that opposing his allegedly rational or truthful vision cannot arise from good intentions.
I believe in no God, no invisible man in the sky. But there is something more powerful than each of us, a combination of our efforts, a great chain of industry that unites us. But it is only when we struggle in our own interest that the chain pulls society in the right direction. The chain is too powerful and too mysterious for any government to guide. Any man who tells you different either has his hand in your pocket or a pistol to your neck.
Here, the dichotomy savage criminal gains an additional distinction within the category of the criminal, a thief-brood pair. Thus, from the initial assumption about the nature of influence, we arrive at the essence of her creation, that is, a black and white world. She herself does not shy away from this. On the contrary, she aggressively confronts the spineless who refuse to see, hiding behind the story of the shades of grey. This is the focus of a chapter within The Virtue of Selfishness, entitled The Cult of Moral Greyness. Here is a telling quote. In any respect one cares to examine, that notion is full of contradictions. Foremost among them is the fallacy of the stolen concept. If there is no black and white, there can be no grey, since grey is merely a mixture of the two. Before one can identify anything as grey, one has to know what is black and what is white. In the field of morality, this means that one must first identify what is good and what is evil. And when a man has ascertained that one alternative is good and the other is evil, he has no justification for choosing a mixture. There can be no justification for choosing any part of that which one knows to be evil. In morality, black is predominantly the result of attempting to pretend to oneself that one is merely grey. The world of pure categories is also what defines Andrew Ryan, who has no doubts when it comes to the truth, as we encounter in the audio recording of his debate with Sofia Lamb, available in the second part of the game.
White is not black, Dr. Lamb. Down is not up, and straw is not gold. Look around you. Rapture is no miracle. It is a product of reason. Impossible unless 1 and 1 are 2, and A equates to A.
This quote is particularly interesting because it also pays homage to the previously mentioned law of identity, to which we will return later. Such a framing in Rand's work effectively determines the nature of her writing, and we can observe consistency in how she constructs characters meant to represent the opposing side in her novels. This arguably creates the greatest artistic void in her work, fully aligned with the clear division between villains and heroes in intellectual history. There simply isn't a single character, as far as I know, in whom the struggle takes place within the soul. Rather, it is externalized entirely with two distinct camps. And not only that, but her dissenters precisely reflect the aforementioned savagery or evil. The binary perspective is evident in both novels: rational versus emotional, creators versus parasites, independent versus second-rate individuals. To borrow the words of Howard Rourke.
Nothing is given to man on Earth. Everything he needs has to be produced. And here man faces his basic alternative. He can survive in only one of two ways: by the independent work of his own mind, or as a parasite fed by the minds of others. The creator originates. The parasite borrows. The creator faces nature alone. The parasite faces nature through an intermediary. The creator's concern is the conquest of nature. The parasite's concern is the conquest of men. The creator lives for his work. He needs no other men. His primary goal is within himself. The parasite lives second-hand. He needs others. Others become his prime motive.
If you have been following the game's narrative, you will have noticed that the very concept of the parasite is what Ryan emphasizes in his speeches, present in his daily addresses to the citizens of Rapture, in the proud tradition of lecturing others, that is, the aesthetic of public appearances embodied by Galt or Rourke. His words echo those two.
What is the difference between a man and a parasite? A man builds, a parasite asks, "Where's my share?" A man creates, a parasite says, "What will the neighbors think?" A man invents, a parasite says, "Watch out, or you might tread on the toes of God."
Once dissenters are dehumanized, reduced to the level of parasites, the course of action becomes clear. The plague must be deprived of its means of sustenance, whether by blowing up an apartment complex because others decided to partially alter your designs, by burning oil fields when the authorities choose to nationalize them, or by setting fire to the forest so that parasites can't enjoy the shade of the canopy. Or, finally, by exterminating the plants of Arcadia with toxic gases and suffocating the rebel. This reflects the collectivization of guilt in which consumers, investors, and passers-by bear responsibility for the misdeeds of authority, just as the innocent in Hiroshima and Nagasaki did. It reflects the logic of burning a granary to eliminate mice. Andrew Ryan is not merely an abnormal man, he is the ideal Ayn Rand aspires to. Whatever does not conform to his reasoning should not exist. This is especially striking given that Rand in her works supposedly places man first. If one were to accept this statement as true, another point must be added, allied with the idea that she does not deal with humans as they are, but humans as they ought to be. It is not her aim to understand Homo sapiens, nor to pursue the truth as a genuine philosopher, nor even to propose a practical philosophy that would enable existing humans to live fuller lives, though it may have unintentionally helped some. Her aim is to define herself what truth is and who deserves recognition of humanity, just like any other ideologue or potential totalitarian. The human being we know as a product of spontaneous evolutionary process bears little resemblance to the man recognized by Ayn Rand. This vision is shared by Ryan, as seen in his response to Lamb's interpretation of art.
Dionysus Park. Lamb mocks me in the naming of this place. She knows precisely how I feel about this celebration of unconscious art. The artist reflects the world as it ought to be, not as it is damned to be by some spasm of the lower mind. I shall not censor. The park is Lamb's property. However, if the case we are building against her proves true, I will return with a sledgehammer.
One might object that Rand simply uses harsh words for narrative purposes, but a closer look reveals genuine hatred toward dissenters and even the mentioned denial of humanity. In the first chapter, we gave examples from her life that already reveal enough but the treatment of opposing voices in her novels shows the same, and nothing changes when we examine her philosophical essays, full of sweeping judgments and commentary. As if that were not already problematic enough, her entire work abounds with entirely arbitrary shifts in the meanings of concepts and myths in order to make what she discusses appear coherent. Whether she introduces a value judgment into the notion of sacrifice, or seeks to separate the concept of selfishness from the alleged harmful intellectual fraud that stunts moral development, the writer creates a map of meaning usable only within the narrow confines of objectivist ideology. But let us begin with a general view of the other. To build her argument, she must speak about people today in the spirit of collectivist thinking and present something hard to believe, allegedly from the perspective of the representatives of humanity of her time, an industrialist who produces a fortune and a gangster who robs a bank are regarded as equally immoral, since they both sought wealth for their own selfish benefit. A young man who gives up his career in order to support his parents and never rises beyond the ranks of grocery clerk is regarded as morally superior to the young man who endures an excruciating struggle and achieves his personal ambition. The result of this logic, in her view, can be nothing more than hostility toward life, and it is precisely altruistic philosophy that is the source of this. Such a worldview permits no view of man except as sacrificial animals and profiteers on sacrifice, as victims and parasites. It permits no concept of a benevolent coexistence among men. It permits no concept of justice. Sounds familiar?
What is the greatest lie ever created? What is the most vicious obscenity ever perpetrated on mankind? Slavery, the Holocaust, dictatorship. No. It's the tool with which all that wickedness is built. Altruism. Whenever anyone wants others to do their work, they call upon their altruism. Never mind your own needs, they say. Think of the needs of whoever. Of the state, of the poor, of the army, of the king, of God. The list goes on and on.
Spinelessness, corruption, evil, that lies on the opposite side. Let us examine how this manifests in the novels, which will reveal the dichotomy of evil and savagery. Responding to the grief of a student who had witnessed a scene in which a mother holds the body of her adult son, who had died of starvation, the great altruist of Atlas Shrugged, the embodiment of evil in the academic world, Dr. Simon Pritchard, denies the occurrence by asking,
How does that woman know that her son is dead? How does she know that he ever existed?
Having listened to the fiery monologue of one of the heroes of Atlas Shrugged, Francisco d'Anconia, the unnamed woman with the earrings are representatives of the imagined elite that delights in grand words and an altruistic worldview, yet in essence embodies irrational savagery, can offer only one comment.
Oh, I can't answer you. I don't have any answers. My mind doesn't work that way. But I don't feel that you're right, so I know that you're wrong.
During a dispute among representatives of the corrupt elite, Oren Boyle, a depraved employer and a manifestation of evil in the world of industry, squeals in alarm at the insinuation that he is more concerned with his own gain than with the needs of others.
What profits? When did I ever make any profits? Nobody can accuse me of running a profit-making business. But of course, the public does need railroads, and perhaps I could manage to absorb a certain raise in rates. If I were to get, it's just a thought, if I were to get a subsidy to carry me over the next year or two, until I catch my stride.
His accomplice in deceit, the brother and antithesis to Dagny Taggart, James Taggart, another manifestation of evil in the world of big capital, reveals through his thoughts that envy and malice arise from the aforementioned value framework.
Well, why not? Why should they have it if we don't? Why should they stand above us? If we are to perish, let's make sure that we all perish together. Let's make sure that we leave them no chance to survive.
Speaking with a client, Howard Rourke, the hero of The Fountainhead, observes that the effort is futile because that woman, as a savage, is incapable of understanding.
He tried to explain and to convince. He knew, while he spoke, that it was useless, because his words sounded as if they were hitting a vacuum. There was no such person as Mrs. Wayne Wilmot. There was only a shell containing the opinions of her friends, the picture postcards she had seen, the novels of country squires she had read. It was this that he had to address, this immateriality which could not hear him or answer, deaf and impersonal like a wad of cotton.
The list goes on. Despite the sheer volume of both novels, the greater part consists of drilling into the same essence. An enormous amount of space is devoted to this reduction of the other to the lowest level. Whether we are speaking of the cowardice of James Taggart in his attempt to evade responsibility, the madness of Kip Chalmers insisting that a train passed through a crumbling tunnel, or the childlike bewilderment of the dean of the Stanton Institute of Technology when faced with the idea that something new might be done, something not already done in antiquity, the Renaissance, or classicism, it is evident that there is no respectable dissenter in any part of these works. All of this, as initially suggested, results in the heroes and their allies being left with only one option: to deny the humanity of those on the opposing side. Thus, Gail Wynand, a media magnate and friend of Howard Rourke, who shares the same worldview, in summarizing the thoughts of his and Rourke's future wife, states,
"One can't love man without hating most of the creatures who pretend to bear his name."
And just so that no one would relativize the above by claiming it is merely the thought of a fictional character, Rand herself, in The Virtue of Selfishness, cites the heroes of her novels as relevant thinkers. Given the elements of her biography we have highlighted, there is no reason to dismiss this quote. Even when segments appear that might be taken as depicting some redeeming characteristic, further reading reveals that such behavior is precisely a negative phenomenon, serving as a manifestation of a flawed worldview. Thus, the central antagonist of The Fountainhead, Ellsworth Toohey, redirects an untouched inheritance of $100,000 left to him by his friend Thomas Foster, aiding the workshop of social study. However, just a few pages later, after the description of the cold-bloodedness with which he faced an assassination attempt, we gain insight into the motive behind this act. It is a mechanical gesture of a thoroughly nihilistic being, an enemy of life, even his own. In other words, it is the realization of the logic of altruism as previously outlined. This is evident throughout the entire chapter devoted to this character, especially in the segments concerning his niece Catherine, who is unable to grasp the source of her own bitterness, malice, and ruthlessness, despite her devoted work in helping others. She herself is astonished.
Why is it that I set out honestly to do what I thought was right, and it's making me rotten?
This summarizes her view of the outcome to which altruism inevitably leads. Through Toohey's monologue a little later, we see that an absolutely selfless being is equated with absolute evil, one that consciously destroys and humiliates.
"I have no private purpose. I want power. I want my world of the future. Let all live for all. Let all sacrifice and none profit. Let all suffer and none enjoy. Let progress stop. Let all stagnate." There's equality in stagnation. All subjugated to the will of all. Universal slavery without even the dignity of a master. Slavery to slavery. A great circle and a total equality. The world of the future.
All of this is visible in the aforementioned understanding of altruism shared by Ryan. But in Ayn Rand, it also acquires paranoid dimensions. Thus, Toohey, later in his speech, testifies to his own role in an apparently global conspiracy of collectivists who offer the world a binary of totalitarian collectivism, both tails and heads, denying the individual whether the focus is on race or class. An echo of this paranoia is also found in Ryan's reflection on the work of Sofia Lamb.
Lamb is becoming a problem. The woman is a damned collectivist. Here in Rapture, how could the council fail to see it? Worse, to hide her intent, she gulls these patients of hers into a religious frenzy. A new Kremlin will rise and swallow the council house before they realize they've been had. I will not have my city swindled by the parasite. Nevertheless, guys, it is time, I think, to call Sinclair.
For the sake of illustration, it is worth recalling the segment on the Grand Inquisitor which we analyzed in the video on Stalker. Recall that Dostoyevsky fashions the smartest and most exceptional characters as bearers of ideas opposed to his own. Not only that, but in every character there exists struggle regardless of their inclination toward reflection. On such foundations, Fyodor Mikhailovich builds his novels, and it is precisely for this reason that he represents the pinnacle of world literature and the fountainhead of intellectual integrity. The deeper one examines Ayn Rand's work, the clearer it becomes that she is very much a daughter of her time and the community from which she originates. In the best tradition of the radicals she opposed, she calls ideology philosophy, labels sweeping, though possibly convincing statements worthy of heated debates as argumentation, and ultimately gives priority to her own definitions over the understanding of phenomena. This, quite predictably, leads to the conclusion that pure capitalism as her ideal never actually existed. Thus, it is the exact same matrix followed by apologists of communism, which, by talking about ideals, allows the creation of safe havens to which a debater can retreat when messy reality strikes, or when the preached politics produces some error or even evil. And when we consider her literary style, we see that it is almost a direct copy of socialist realism, which under Stalin was mandated as obligatory. The purpose of this movement was precisely to depict reality and people not as they are, but as they ought to be, with central features including ideological devotion that left no room for doubt or ambiguity, as these were considered signs of weakness and deviation from the true path. A central character as hero, a positive figure embodying the ideal of conduct that is humanity. Optimism, which even in moments of challenge lies in the subtext. Clarity of language and plot as a prerequisite for accessibility to the broader populace. A teleological vision of the historical course, inevitably leading to the realization of communism, filled with contrasts between old and new, backward and progressive, irrational and rational. Collectivism over individualism, where the doubts and alienation of the individual are overridden by the strength and security of the collective. Thus, if we simply replace the elements in the last segment and in the target historical trajectory substitute communist with a capitalist utopia such as Galt's Gulch, upon which Rapture is modeled, we get the blueprint for Ayn Rand's novels. All of this, of course, results in idealization and absolutism, whether speaking of merchants who can only be positive, despite historical evidence of their darker sides, or of market fundamentalism, which in Ryan's case takes the form of the Great Chain. The template of unreality, which the communists shamelessly called realism, Rand, with cosmetic modifications, calls objectivism, to which she herself arrived. Simply put, wherever we look, it appears that her entire body of work is merely a personal revenge against the Reds, and that, in the spirit of Dr. Pillman, whom we cited in video on Stalker, she constructed a system that allows her to understand everything, yet learn nothing. Now, I hope the causal chain becomes clear, the metaphorical great chain of objectivist ideology, in which elements, like links, connect one to another. Beginning with an understanding of influence reduced to the things we accept and consciously process, which shapes our conception of human rationality, independence, and morality, it further results in perceiving those who deviate from truth as we ourselves see it, as negators of morality, whether in the form of ignorant, irrational savagery or conscious evil. This, in turn, shapes how we think, write, and speak about them, culminating in the public dehumanization of dissenters, and ultimately with participation in the persecution of artists by serving state inquisition, in justifying the destruction of civilian targets in war, and even in defending obvious fraud and the annihilation of weaker human communities, those unlucky enough not to have acquired the knowledge and technologies attained by the collective to which we belong. Yet, all of this is tied to activity within a system that the objectivists did not create. BioShock, therefore, raises the question of the final link missing from our historical experience. How would this chain end if Ayn Rand had the opportunity to define the system? And here, imagination provides answers through the creator of Rapture. The game, from its very beginning and the plane crashing into the Atlantic just off the lighthouse, reimagines the fall of Dagny's plane into Galt's Gulch and begins to explore the fundamental question: what would this utopia actually look like over time? From the first glimpse of Rapture's panorama, it reflects Rand's awe at the New York skyline, so much so that even the water around the porthole of the submarine can serve as a metaphor for the tears of splendor that the author shed upon seeing the magnificence of this city. Moreover, the cultural entrenchment of Rapture, musical, architectural, and visual, in a style tied to the US between 1920s and 1940s, testifies to the fate of prescriptive ideologies, a feature that is clearly visible in Rand since, as far as I know, she is the only allegedly libertarian thinker to have introduced the question of objectivity into the realm of aesthetics. Yet the direct connection to the novel also reveals a cheap trick employed by emotionally charged but not particularly spectacular art, dropping of the curtain on the stage at the moment of victory for the bearers of the new system, without illuminating the details that tomorrow will bring. Because the devil is in the details, details that are best avoided. Slovenian philosopher Slavoj Žižek beautifully illustrates this in his commentary on the film V for Vendetta, while the video game represents a legitimate effort at exploring the potential trajectory of the objectivist utopia, offering details primarily through audio logs and communication via radio transmitters. We have already had the opportunity to hear some of Ryan's thoughts, but to illuminate the rest, a few more words would be useful. Words that echo the absolutization of market forces characteristic of Ayn Rand's thinking, while also laying a solid foundation for highlighting the key questions of her utopia. Let us first look at two speeches that summarize the essence both concerning regulation and the consequences of plasmid use.
There has been tremendous pressure to regulate this plasmid business. There have been side effects, blindness, insanity, death. But what use is our ideology if it is not tested? The market does not respond like an infant, shrieking at the first sign of displeasure. The market is patient, and we must be too.
Ryan remains consistent in refusing to implement regulatory measures that would limit plasmid use, and echoing the contempt we saw earlier directed equally at Stalin and Roosevelt, once again invokes the logic of the great chain.
Is there blood in the streets? Of course. Have some chosen to destroy themselves with careless splicing? Undeniable. But I will make no proclamations. I will dictate no laws. The great chain moves slowly, but with wisdom. It is our impatience that invites in the parasite of big government. And once you've invited it in, it will never stop feeding on the body of the city.
Thus, despite the grim indicators, Ryan does not deviate from his ideological perspective, reducing everything to the labor pains of a system that functions slowly. In doing so, the game shows, and through its sequel confirms, that although objectivism serves as the foundation upon which the narrative is built, the core message is that all ideological systems collapse under the weight of genuine human psychology. Not only does that psychology shape a market development he did not anticipate, but it also underlies his refusal to yield and acknowledge the flaws in his own understanding of human nature. For a system to function, it must be flexible. It must be capable of evolution, reassessment, and refinement. Yet, even that does not guarantee an outcome that appears desirable from our current perspective, as it may evolve toward forms of authoritarianism we find unacceptable. On the other hand, this very problem helps illuminate what is perhaps the key question of Galt's Gulch, as well as the fall of Rapture. Even if we accept the idea that market competition is the best method of organizing economic life, can spontaneous order also be applied to the competition of ideas? Can the great chain in this domain demonstrate the advantages of its gradual operation, pulling our worldview toward new horizons of understanding? Can our current conception of a system that provides the pinnacle of freedom be questioned, or must it stand as an unchangeable axiom? And ultimately, are Ryan and Rand mistaken in their understanding of the market? For they overlook that, contrary to their idealized notion of a rational outcome, market forces are nothing more than the expression of the will or preference of the majority, articulated through the sum of individual actions. Why should the consumption of sugary carbonated drinks be considered a rational outcome, while the preaching and mass acceptance of esoteric ideas would not be? We might say that it is obvious that esotericism is not aligned with objective reality, but the same is true of the fact that the beverages produced by big corporations are not healthy. In fact, they are harmful and lead to various diseases. That is, they are not in line with the reality of human organism. Where then do we draw the line? The game takes this question seriously. It may be easy for Ryan to tolerate a few eccentrics wandering the streets, but what happens when an ideological disease begins to spread like wildfire? What happens when somebody challenges the ideology of the great chain and the existing order? Likewise, it is easy for Rand, in an imagined world of like-minded individuals, to sketch the contours of Galt's Gulch, but a serious question remains. What if someone believes things could be different, and what if somebody wishes to leave, but those remaining in the utopia cannot guarantee that the departing individual will not reveal their location or technology? These questions are tied to the theme we have already explored in discussing Stalker, the tension between order and chaos which troubled the Strugatsky brothers and which forms an irresolvable paradox. Thus, despite the writer's conviction, paradoxes do indeed exist, and their nature is not merely tied to inconsistencies between our premises and reality, but to our inherent inability, at least within our current intellectual and epistemic framework, to fully comprehend that reality. Ryan does not permit departure to the surface, fearing the compromise of the utopia, yet he initially accepts the notion of a marketplace of idea proposed by Bill McDonough and engages in debate with Sofia Lamb, who sees things differently. Confronting Ryan on the nature of reality and building on his conclusion that Rapture is not a miracle but a consequence of the fact that 1 and 1 make 2 and that A equates to A, Lamb responds.
And yet, alone, each man is a prisoner to bias, dream, delusion, or the pain of a phantom limb. To one man, they are as real as rain. Reality is consensus, and the people are losing faith. Take a walk, Andrew. It is raining in Rapture, and you have simply chosen not to notice.
Sofia even dares to point out the fetishistic character of Ryan's ideology, striking at a very great chain.
Ask yourself, Andrew, what is your great chain of progress but of faith? The chain is a symbol for an irrational force guiding us towards ascension. No less mystic than the crucifixes you seize and burn.
This applies entirely to Ayn Rand's understanding of reason and capitalism, the former of which we will address later, while the latter is illuminated through her idea of pure capitalism. Now, even though Ryan likely finds his own ideas brilliant, this debate reveals that others do not necessarily see things the same way, and the loud enthusiasm of the audience later in the recording demonstrates this. Yet, that very enthusiasm rests on the fact that it is one thing to speak of opportunity and progress, and quite another to construct a system that can effectively coordinate different ambitions while leaving enough room for all of them to be fulfilled. In their pursuit of a better life, the inhabitants of Rapture discovered that the space for advancement is always limited, regardless of how much those boundaries expand, and that there are no guarantees the market will produce sufficiently satisfying jobs for everyone. This is noted by Frank Fontaine, one of Ryan's greatest enemies, who builds his populist movement precisely on this fact.
These sad saps. They come to Rapture thinking they're gonna be captains of industry. But they all forget that somebody's gotta scrub the toilets. What an angle they gave me. I hand these mugs a cot and a bowl of soup, and they give me their lives. Who needs an army when I got Fontaine's Home for the Poor?
Thus, inequality may indeed be an inherent feature of reality, but it is also a potential that ignites the spirit of those who lose in the competition. It is not even necessary to assume that these people came to Rapture without truly believing in the same principles as Ryan. It is enough to ask, how long would your will, or your supposedly unyielding reason, endure under the assault of utter poverty? How long would your principles withstand the cries of your hungry child or spouse? How long before you hacked the ironically named circus of value? Add to this the fact that leaving in search of better conditions elsewhere is not possible, as it could compromise the utopia and affect the morale of those who remain. And even if the cleaners were to leave, would Ryan take up the garbage bin, or would the city gradually turn into a septic pit? In other words, there is no release valve. Ryan certainly becomes aware of the volatility of this powder keg, which is why he decides to remove Sofia Lamb from public life, both because she articulates the discontent of the masses and because she offers ideas of an alternative order.
Do you remember what you told me, Bill? A marketplace of ideas. That was you. If I submit to the debates with Lamb, we defang her. I have done so. And have you been to Pauper's Drop, Bill? Listen.
When you're down.
Between each song, these Oblomovs hand out her manifesto. Her face adorns every wall. Saint Lamb. You made her, McDonough. And now, you will convince the council to sponsor her silence.
This is a very interesting recording as it contains two elements that further illuminate the nature of objectivist reasoning. First, we see that failure in debating Lamb leads to her gaining greater significance in the public eye, which Ryan attributes to Bill, who introduced him to the concept of the marketplace of ideas. Second, Ryan uses the term Oblomovs, an allusion to the novel by Russian writer Ivan Alexandrovich Goncharov, which develops the concept of the superfluous man. Ilya Ilyich Oblomov, the protagonist, represents a man of many talents and potentials that remain unrealized due to fear and a lack of will in the face of life's challenges. Both examples point to the problem of psychologization or individualization in Ryan's reasoning, as well as in that of Ayn Rand. Any phenomenon that raises or illuminates systemic failures, whether in Ryan's argumentation or in the established order, triggers a counter-argument focused on the personality of the individual raising the issue. It is a logical continuation of the idea of parasites and second-rate people. Something must simply be wrong with them personally. This is known as the pathologization of dissent. Moreover, echoing the previously described paranoia of a global collectivist conspiracy, expressed through Ellsworth Toohey's monologue in The Fountainhead, and stemming from a system of pure categories and an unwillingness to recognize the flaws in one's own maps of meaning, Ryan, obsessed with syndicalism, the infiltration of red parasites, and the activities of agencies like the CIA or KGB, demands that Sofia's memory be erased.
Sinclair, I don't care how you accomplish Lamb's removal from the public eye. Indeed, I'd rather cease contact with you altogether. But allow me to make this plain. I don't want to see Lamb on the streets again, peddling her Bolshevik fever dreams to my people. Bury her memory, Sinclair. Bury it, and salt the earth.
When the hive is disturbed, is it not rational to remove the source of stress? Objectivists might argue here that Rand never advocated suppressing ideas and that despite all the links in the objectivist great chain we have outlined, there is no reason to believe it would come to that. They might also say that the market coordinates references, while philosophy seeks truth, and therefore the relativistic notion of a marketplace of ideas is not appropriate. If truth is the measure, then there is no symmetry among ideas. Unlike beverages and individual preferences, some ideas are true and others are not. But such a response would miss the point. The aim is not to relativize everything into meaninglessness, but to pose a simple question. Is confidence in objective truth compatible with the system's ability to acknowledge uncertainty about its own principles, allow debate and disagreement, and adapt to new discoveries and perspectives? Scientific systems revise their theories based on data. Democratic systems protect minority rights. Sensible educational or corporate systems remain open to questioning their assumptions. By contrast, Ayn Rand's organization, as well as Galt's Gulch, which requires a settler to take a formal oath, a concept in itself quite strange from the perspective of rationality required by Rand's philosophy, treat their own systems as unquestionable, leaving no room for internal critique while dismissing external challenges as part of a harmful intellectual fraud. In this way, they fall into a simple trap. If ideological systems treat themselves as beyond debate, they risk collapsing when confronted with unforeseen elements or variability in human behavior. The system becomes architectural, not adaptive. The dismissal of this as a strained interpretation is challenged by at least 3 points. First, it is true that Rand did not advocate institutional prohibition and insisted on freedom of speech, but she did maintain that a private owner must have the right to refuse the publication of ideas he finds objectionable. Thus, if we have a small number of media owners who share the same worldview, this creates the potential for exposure to only one type of idea, especially considering that Ryan, like Galt, selects those fit for his utopia based on ideological alignment. Moreover, regardless of the formal absence of bans on alternative media, if such voices emerge within the utopia but lack the capital, capacity, or sponsorship to establish their own platforms, the problem persists. Second, despite her opposition to formal bans, Rand's participation in the activities of HUAC, which we mentioned earlier, demonstrates how easily one can slide into indirectly contributing to the suppression of alternative ideas through pressure. It is not necessary for someone to explicitly forbid you from writing about certain topics or to confiscate your printing press. It is enough for authorities to take an interest in your work and for colleagues in your field to report on you, thereby conditioning your future behavior. Third, the fate of the objectivist movement under Ayn Rand's leadership reveals her authoritarian tendencies and the architectural nature of her system. At one point, a split occurred within the organization when Rand expelled Nathaniel and Barbara Brandon for allegedly abandoning objectivist principles. This is compounded by the fact that she had a romantic relationship with Nathaniel, making it difficult to believe that her reaction was not influenced by an emotional collapse, though this is of secondary importance here. The essence is that she claimed the authority to determine who could and who could not be an objectivist, and this pair was not the only one expelled. And if that is not sufficient, we may add the fact that Leonard Peikoff, mentioned earlier, was designated by Rand as her legal and intellectual heir. Now, while the question of legal inheritance makes sense, the latter clearly suggests something closer to an ideological cult than a philosophical school. Even though all of this already significantly undermines objectivism, we may add one final nail to the coffin. What was evident in Rand's public appearances and writings, that she constructed a closed system intolerant of demands for reassessment or change, was explicitly formulated by her anointed successor Peikoff in his text Fact and Value. Reflecting on David Kelly's interpretation of objectivism, he clearly rejects the idea that Rand's philosophy is not a closed system. To quote, "Philosophy, as Ayn Rand often observed, deals only with the kinds of issues available to men in any era. It does not change with the growth of human knowledge, since it is the base and precondition of that growth. New implications, applications, integrations can always be discovered. But the essence of the system, its fundamental principles and their consequences in every branch, is laid down once and for all by the philosophy's author. If this applies to any philosophy, think how much more obviously it applies to objectivism. Objectivism holds that every truth is an absolute, and that a proper philosophy is an integrated whole, any change in any element of which would destroy the entire system. I believe it is clear from this that Rand's choice of successor was entirely fitting. Peikoff is consistent with her ideas, credit where it is due. Why then would the creators of Rapture or Galt's Gulch be any different? Why would they not retain the right to expel the unfit, justified through narratives about violating principles or private property? This is precisely the fate that befalls Rapture, whose creator, step by step confronted with shifting challenges, slides into the construction of a parastate structure under his control, eventually descending into full authoritarianism. The first step on that path is the question of loyalty, fundamental to any community and tied to the selection of the utopia's inhabitants. Rand rejected the idea that one must be loyal to a particular individual based on factors unrelated to their virtues. Through the characters of Galt and Rourke, we see that she considered it a person's primary duty to be loyal to their own mind and principles, and that is, to themselves. Yet, she also addressed the question of relations toward others. To quote, "Love, friendship, respect, admiration are the emotional responses of one man to the virtues of another, the spiritual payment given in exchange for the personal, selfish pleasure which one man derives from the virtues of another man's character. In spiritual issues, a trader is a man who does not seek to be loved for his weaknesses or flaws, only for his virtues, and who does not grant his love to the weaknesses or the flaws of others, only to their virtues." From this, we may conclude that she declaratively rejects blind loyalty to an individual, tying it instead to principles. However, based on everything else she said, as well as the aforementioned experience with Nathaniel Brandon, we can also say that her system demands complete loyalty to so-called objective truth. It is clear, after everything we have outlined, that we must add a small clarification here, to the objective truth as she defines it. The creators of BioShock play with this masked subjectivity through Ryan's character. "My feelings about loyalty," Ryan said carefully, "are very particularized. I believe a man must be loyal to himself first, but I also look for men who believe what I believe. Men who believe it enough that they know that being loyal to me is being loyal to themselves." Here, the perspective of Leonard Peikoff is highly relevant. In one of his podcasts, he clearly expressed concern about immigration, stating that 80% of Latin Americans, regardless of wealth or whether they are self-made, vote for Democrats, and that further influx will result in the destruction of the United States. He concludes by saying that this is not a matter of what he thinks in theory, that there is no place for theory at that moment, because they have reached the end of the road. This stance led to a debate between Peikoff and Yaron Brook, in which the former continued to argue that employers seeking immigrants do not have the right to do something objectively harmful to the country and its population. Although he ultimately conceded to Brook's arguments, he did so with reservations, stating that open immigration is acceptable only as long as it does not strengthen what he sees as a destructive political party, clearly referring to the Democrats. The issue of immigration in the United States and its political tensions is not important here, nor am I sufficiently informed to engage in that debate. What matters is the line of reasoning we have been tracing. Not only do we counter a subjective appeal to objective harm, no longer tied to rejection of objectivist principles, but to alignment with a particular political party, but we also see the dismissal of self-made individuals based on what appears to be an ethnically or racially conditioned incorrect vote. Thus, a self-made individual who does not align with objectivism, despite his brilliance, excellence, or effort, cannot be celebrated like Rourke precisely because of the initially explained necessity of dismissing differing reasoning as a consequence of either malicious intent or savagery. We previously noted that Brooke belongs to a generation that significantly revised Rand's positions, but it is important to remember that Peikoff is her anointed successor. His words derive legitimacy from Rand's own choice and reveal the essence: people must be loyal to objective truth as she sees it. That is the ultimate result of consistently applied objectivism, and Ryan embodies it. The second issue concerns freedom of the press within the utopia, something we could justifiably consider a prerequisite for a marketplace of idea. Once again, the BioShock novel reveals much. The train slowed as they came into the station near Adonis. Poole, scribbling in his notebook, was somehow aware of Ryan's scrutiny. He looked up to see Andrew Ryan frowning at him. Ryan raised an inquiring eyebrow. "You do remember our talk? Nothing unauthorized, Poole." Poole swallowed, tempted to point out that Ryan's heavy hand on Rapture's newspaper was counter to his talk of freedom, but then Ryan was the major shareholder in the Tribune, and Stanley Poole had never heard of a newspaper that expressed an opinion its owners didn't like. This narrative thread mirrors the fate of the major media house in the Fountainhead, whose employee Alva Scharet, unlike Stanley Poole, decides to raise the issue of the press freedom, only to encounter the straightforward reasoning of the newspaper's leading figure.
Alva, if I had not sat on the stairs of the Gazette for a week, where would be the press for them to be free on?
The owner, then, is not obligated to uphold freedom of the press, which is entirely consistent with Ryan's rejection of the marketplace of ideas. His ownership, or the effort he has invested, becomes the source of this right. You will notice that here, paraphrasing a likely apocryphal thought of Mark Twain, the problem is not merely someone's malicious intent or propagandistic zeal, those are always present, but a deep conviction in the truth of something that simply is not so, which is then imposed with full force through the media controlled by the bearer of such ideas. Objectivism is a paradigm of this. The final link in the great chain of objectivist ideology becomes increasingly clear, yet something is still missing. What would happen if someone decided to spread undesirable ideas or establish trade with the outside world without Ryan's or Galt's knowledge? What if someone simply changed their mind and wished to leave? We have already seen that the heated tensions in Rapture lead to Lamb's arrest, and that the nature of the objectivist movement suggests near certainty that problematic content, such as Bible, would be prosecuted for allegedly violating the objective truth, with blame assigned to it for errors actually stemming from the objectivist order itself. How then does one maintain the system and know what people are saying, doing, or thinking in the vast corridors of Rapture? Well, by forming some kind of security organization, a spy network, and detention facilities. Returning once more to the irresolvable paradox of order and chaos described by the Strugatsky brothers, objectivism offers nothing particular new as a solution. Such a development is inevitable when a community is founded on rigid ideological preconceptions and someone decides to question, at worst, to change that world. It is only one step away from metastasizing into authoritarianism, because every move that restricts the other, whether openly or indirectly, inevitably provokes a response, producing a spiral of struggle between the forces of freedom, which are also forces of chaos, and the forces of order, which are also forces of absolutization and totalitarianism. It does not matter that there was no malicious intent at the beginning. All of this reveals yet another problem that Ayn Rand overlooks and Peikoff dismisses. Precisely because of the prescriptive architectural nature of her ideology, new information cannot reshape the rules she defined before encountering that information, because doing so would undermine the entire system. However, due to the refuge of the pure model she herself constructed, any reference to the negative consequences of the actions of supposedly rational individuals such as free market speculation in technology, climate change and other negative externalities of fossil fuel use, public health issues and the question of voluntary vaccination in complex systems, or the opioid crisis born of aggressive pharmaceutical marketing, can be dismissed through some confabulation about state interference. This does not mean that strict regulation is the solution. Rather, one must be aware of the irrational overconfidence in an ideological matrix. The same pattern is clearly visible in Ryan's speeches that we have cited. This ultimately brings us back to the question of consistency and the evil that may arise from it, which we discussed in the video on Prince Arthas in Warcraft 3, drawing on Leszek Kolakowski. The problem is further complicated by the fact that the same framework of thought and action may previously have produced extraordinary achievements. All of this is clearly manifested in Ryan, who begins to recognize it himself, yet finds a new reason to remain on the same path.
Could I have made mistakes? One does not build cities if one is guided by doubt. But can one govern in absolute certainty? I know that my beliefs have elevated me just as I know that the things I have rejected would have destroyed me. But the city, it's collapsing before my... Have I become so convinced by my own beliefs that I have stopped seeing the truth? Perhaps. But Atlas is out there, and he aims to destroy me and to destroy my city. To question is to surrender. I will not question.
Consistency to the very end, just like Rourke and Galt. Only Ryan's end is not illuminated by the light of victory. So, we have seen where the ban on the Bible, the prosecution of smugglers, the suppression of the free press, and the arrest of Sofia Lamb come from, but we are still left with the question of where the market shocks that disturb the hive originate, and how Frank Fontaine acquires such power. Once again, the source lies in Ryan's ideological blindness. Fontaine is certainly a highly intriguing character, a man who, after committing murder, assumes the identity of his victim and thus gains entry into Rapture, and whose very name carries interesting symbolism. First, the surname Fontaine is a clear allusion to the title of the novel, The Fountainhead, while the name Frank may be connected to Ayn Rand's husband, Frank O'Connor. This latter claim may seem highly speculative, but consider the following. Frank O'Connor was an actor, and it is precisely Frank in the game who takes on the role of Atlas. In this way, the narrative plays with objectivism on multiple levels. First, unlike the Fountainhead described by Rand, which represents creative origin and integrity, the Fountainhead within the game is marked by duplicity, parasitism, and opportunism, traits that nonetheless lead to unimaginable heights. Second, Frank Fontaine is, from the outset, a fabricated persona, a performance by a highly capable yet corrupt man who adopts another's identity. Third, adapting to his conflict with Ryan, Fontaine later assumes yet another identity, inspired by the words of Sofia Lamb, which he names Atlas. In this role, he presents himself as an Irish revolutionary of working-class origin, all of with the aim of manipulating the workers of Rapture, as well as us, the players. However, the very name Atlas also carries multiple layers of symbolism. On a basic level, it is clearly a reference to the novel Atlas Shrugged, though instead of a representative of the productive elite who metaphorically bears the world on his shoulders, we are given a self-made con artist who attains such power by exploiting and deceiving others. In contrast to Ayn Rand's idealized vision, we may invoke an image of an extraordinary man who lived and worked in the United States from the mid-19th century to the 1920s, a period regarded by Rand as the golden age of capitalism, in order to illuminate the complex character of the entrepreneur in general. This individual is John Henry Patterson, the founder of NCR. Although his achievements are undeniable and his legacy immense, he also possessed darker traits like any other human being. Patterson viewed his company as a personal fiefdom. He constantly hired and fired employees even for the smallest mistakes. Surveillance was thorough, and managers were expected to enforce strict discipline, as he believed that fear and pressure could produce better results. He also believed he had the right to control his employees' private lives, monitoring their habits and demanding adherence to strict moral standards and ways of living. He was accused of price manipulation, persecuting competitors, and other illegal activities, and was ultimately convicted under the Sherman Antitrust Act, though the verdict was later overturned. He created such a corporate culture that he has been labeled one of the first architects of the corporate cult, and he was also marked by volatility, outbursts of anger, and authoritarianism. Interestingly, he offered various benefits to his workers and helped rebuild Dayton after major floods, which led part of the public to defend him, something that could be viewed through a populist lens. Be that as it may, it is clear that he was a colorful personality. By casting Fontaine as Atlas, the game effectively constructs a counterweight to Galt and his circle, illuminating the other side of every great man's personality. After all, did not Frank also open a home for the poor? On the other hand, I previously pointed out that Rand distorts the meaning of concepts and myths so that they can function within the ideological framework of objectivism, and this fully applies to the story of Atlas as well. Contrary to her rather naive version, expressed through the words of Francisco d'Anconia addressed to Hank Rearden, that he would call upon Atlas to shrug the world off and rebel, we might once again examine what actually lies behind this myth. In the Greek original, Atlas was a titan who took part in the rebellion against Zeus as one of his principal opponents. Likewise, Fontaine was part of the rebellion against Ryan, perhaps its central figure. After his defeat, Atlas was punished to bear the heavens on his shoulders, not the world, so simply shrugging it off would make no sense, as it would crush him as well. However, what the mythological Atlas attempted to do was to deceive Heracles, the son of Zeus, and a mortal woman, into taking on this burden, betraying a previously agreed-upon pact they had entered into of their own free will. Heracles is initially deceived, but later manages to reverse the situation and return Atlas to his place. Is it not obvious then that Fontaine, after his initial defeat, returns as Atlas and deceives the son of Zeus, Heracles, that is Ryan's son Jack, which means us as a player, in an attempt to shift the burden of the revolution onto another while reaping its rewards himself? The mythological Atlas, for all his qualities, is a trickster who seeks to pass his suffering on to others. In the end, Jack nonetheless manages to defeat the game's version of Atlas. A third point worth noting is that Fontaine, in the role of a working-class revolutionary, constructs a populist myth of the people as the bearers of the world in order to mobilize the masses, just as Rand constructs an equivalent myth of the entrepreneur, thereby participating in the ideological framework of the United States and contributing to the mobilization of the masses against communism. Just as d'Anconia in the novel plays the role of a wastrel in service of his own vision of a higher goal, so too does Fontaine play the revolutionary for the sake of his own. Yet, through this portrayal of Atlas in symbiosis with the character of Ryan, the game ultimately reminds us that it is worth reflecting on the problem of the concentration of power, on our sense of comfort in knowing that a single man or a small number of people hold the world on their shoulders and can easily decide to change that. The idealization of this titan as a hero thus becomes questionable, and the mechanism for Rapture's self-destruction, which Ryan consciously built into his utopia and ultimately set in motion, serves as a reminder of that imbalance of power and the consequences of letting the heavens fall. The brilliance of this plot, in fact, lies in its dismantling of at least 4 myths: the idea of the heroic individual who carries civilization, the idea of the revolutionary hero who represents the people, the idea of our complete freedom of choice as the protagonist, and the idea of a stable identity. This last point is especially important as it presents life as a grand stage upon which we assume different roles depending on context, in line with the theory of the sociologist Erving Goffman. Rapture itself is a theater in which Ryan publicly performs the role of a great industrial philosopher, while privately concealing all the subjectivity and fragility that mark each of us, just as Rand performs the role of a philosopher of objectivity, interpreting any opposition to herself as an attack on the objective. It is a theater in which Fontaine first publicly plays the role of a great entrepreneur, or the Atlas envisioned by Rand, and then Atlas as a hero of the people and a proletarian revolutionary, all the while concealing his desire for power and control. It is a stage upon which, in the end, we ourselves play the bearer of the story and the agent of action, who in the background is nothing more than a puppet conditioned to respond to the kindly phrasing of a virtual persona. Would you kindly? Moreover, this is reinforced by the fact that Atlas, when mentioning his family, cites the names Patrick and Moira.
Me wife Moira, she's a right pain in the neck, but she's a beauty. She means the world to me. I can't help feel God's punishing me for bringing her and Patrick to this place. I thought this would be a better life for us. Can you imagine a bigger fool than that?
I must admit that this detail only caught my attention during my most recent playthrough a few months ago, as I was simultaneously reading the novel set in Rapture, which mentions a musical production bearing the names of this pair. From that moment on, the promotional posters across Rapture became obvious to me. Everything is a part of one grand performance. Further support for this is indirectly provided throughout by Sander Cohen, who views Rapture as a stage and its inhabitants as actors or props, behaving like a demiurge who uses the creator's material to craft his own scene. This stands as a warning about the nature of those who dream of utopia or attempt to create it. Demiurge does not care about human fate, as he is blinded by the image he is drawing, using other people's lives as raw material. Be that as it may, we have said that Ryan's ideological blindness forms the foundation of Frank Fontaine's rise. His faith in the market mechanism is absolute, making him insensitive to the pleas of certain entrepreneurs who complain about unfair competition.
Gregory, don't come whining to me about market forces, and don't expect me to punish citizens for showing a little initiative. If you don't like what Fontaine is doing, well, I suggest you find a way to offer a better product.
From this speech, it is not entirely clear who Gregory is or what exactly he was complaining about, but in the novel we find a description of the difficulties faced by another vendor. Namely, Mr. Gravenstein files a complaint regarding the behavior of Gordon Shepp, who decided to charge him 10 times more than others for garbage collection services, with the aim of destroying his business. Despite disapproving of such practices, Ryan refuses to take any action, and the situation ends in murder and suicide. In many places, it is evident that Ayn Rand does not approve of a range of problematic practices, yet she tells us nothing about how they should be addressed. On the contrary, one gets the impression that, in her vision of a perfect market, such practices would not be possible because they are irrational, though she does not go into detail. Let us return to our example from Rapture. This concerns a relationship between two adults without coercion or direct theft. One entrepreneur simply decides to drastically raise the prices for a single individual, enabled by his monopolistic position. Of course, in her well-known interview with Mike Wallace, Rand emphasizes that monopolies are not possible in a truly free society, claiming they are always the result of state intervention. However, even if that were the case, it is clear that economic power tends to translate into other forms of power, such as political or military, and vice versa. What exactly would prevent an exceptionally successful entrepreneur from forming his own team of security forces, supporters, and so on, and begin to convert one form of power into another, thereby creating within a truly free society a closed domain that effectively becomes a new state? There is no clear answer, so we are presumably meant to assume that such behavior would be irrational and that a truly successful individual would not engage in it, which would mean moving from the realm of empirical reality into the realm of imagined constructs defined by the adjective truly. One further detail that speaks volumes about the question of rationality and irrationality among market actors, and which stems from Ryan's faith in human reason, though it is often overlooked, concerns the collapse of the Rapture Bank, brought about by panic that swept through the market.
That's it.
We have to close down the limbo. Bomb goes off in that fancy place uptown and everybody panics. Pulls their money out of the banks. A whole city tugging on the same dollar bill. So the banks fold. And maybe 1 in 10 got their savings out. Who's gonna come here and me nightingaling about how broke they are? How am I gonna provide for little Eleanor?
In the novel set in Rapture, we see that Bill sensibly warned Ryan and called for intervention, at least until the hysteria subsided. But Ryan remained steadfast in his vision, believing that the impending collapse would be a reflection of the market's spontaneous self-correction, which would weed out the irrational. Ryan is also initially impressed by Fontaine, which blinds him to the true nature of Frank's entrepreneurship. Later, however, he begins to realize that something is amiss.
This Fontaine fellow is somebody to watch. Once he was just a menace, to be convicted and hung. But he always manages to be where the evidence isn't. He's the most dangerous type of hoodlum, a kind with vision.
Yet he remains consistent with his principles and refuses to arrest him without clear evidence. However, since obtaining such evidence is a slow process, the confrontation with Fontaine occurs when he has already grown into a formidable force, ending in the worst possible outcome for Ryan's ideology, nationalization, a result that Fontaine desires, fully aware of the consequences that violating one's own principles will have on public opinion.
This facility belongs to the city now, to Ryan Industries, at least until the rioting subsides. While it is unfortunate that such measures had to be taken, I must admit, it is gratifying to see this building condemned. Fontaine is gone, Lamb is gone, or close enough. I am alone at last, alone with my city.
Even after all of this, the interpretation of this move is again tied to the evil of altruism. As with Rand, there is no attribution of error to the system he preaches, nor to his own reasoning.
There has been a lot of idle talk from gadflies and naysayers following the nationalization of Fontaine futuristics. I believe in free men and free markets, but I also believe in my city. And Frank Fontaine's purpose was nothing less than the destruction of Rapture. It was he who gave comfort to the laggards and layabouts. It was he who coddled the tramps and vagabonds. Fontaine was poisoning the people of Rapture. But his venom wasn't made of arsenic or strychnine, no. It was concocted from something far deadlier. It was brewed from altruism.
Finally, we come to the last and perhaps the most significant stressor, Adam. This genetic modification material serves, on one hand, as an artistic rendering of the privileges wealth brings, allowing money in this scenario to translate into literal superiority over others, whether through beauty, strength, or powers such as telekinesis, electric shocks, or firebombs. In effect, it visualizes the concept of wealth reproduction, where initial material or financial supremacy provides new advantages in later stages, making one even more dominant in any market competition and effectively eliminating potential rivals. Of course, we must acknowledge that elite and wealth fluctuations are evident in our reality. However, the idealization of the objectivist type remains blind to unquestionable structural advantages that operate independently of one's talent, ambition, or effort. These qualities alone do not guarantee success, no matter how free the society may be. Additionally, Rapture is a space for human experimentation where participants, at least initially, voluntarily come to be test subjects. There is no coercion, no theft, only an agreement among adults, but this does not change the fact that the poor are the ones who decide to participate, nor does it mitigate the lack of protection against negative consequences that may emerge later or that we cannot anticipate a priori. The situation becomes more complex when orphans and abandoned children from the poorest districts are added to the equation, which is certainly inconsistent with the idea of free choice. Yet, through the radicalization of the game scenarios, it highlights an important oversight on Rand's part. Instead of the idea that exploitation cannot exist if all relationships are based on free choice, we are presented with a notion that free choices made under deprivation and desperation have little to do with meaningful freedom. Equally important is the second issue Adam raises, the question of limits, or the paradoxical moment in which quantity becomes quality. One of the main characteristics of the scientific marvel from the underwater utopia, unconstrained by petty morality, is its addictive nature, which of course becomes apparent only afterward. The long-term consequences of Adam use include both addiction and physical transformation, that is, mutation in the worst sense. The deformed but agile and strong bodies of the splicers illustrate this clearly. Naturally, given her constant emphasis on reason, it is clear that Ayn Rand is not an advocate of opiates or anything that could compromise the rationality of individual minds. In our case, however, this is not the primary concern because the issue is different. In the lecture titled Apollo and Dionysus, we find her understanding of regulation issues, even concerning the most potent drugs. To quote, "I do not approve of any government controls over consumption, so all restrictions on drugs should be removed. I don't believe that the government has the right to tell adults what they do with their own health and their own life. That places a much greater moral responsibility on the individual. For adults, I think they should be free to kill themselves in any way they want." With the caveat regarding minors, we see that she remains consistent with the idea of individual choice and responsibility. It is not difficult to conclude that irrational behavior caused by drug use cannot justify violating the principles of a community. Courts and prisons would, of course, duly convict and incarcerate, but what about the problem of negative externalities? And returning to the question of limits, does Ayn Rand or Objectivism have an answer to the seemingly simple question? At what point does individual madness become a social problem? For just as one addict makes choices that ruin their own life, a mass of addicts becomes a force that erodes the foundation of the very order that grants them freedom. That mass burdens the community's legal and health system, destroys social bonds, spreads defeatism, kills the will to struggle, and undermines faith in the future. It raises an entire series of moral dilemmas. Does a person who falls ill due to constant exposure to the evils of drugs have priority access to a community's medical resources simply because he can pay more than someone who, despite living a healthy life, suffers illness but cannot afford treatment? Do friends, parents, or siblings have the right to intervene physically to restrain someone who cannot control his drug impulses but is not directly threatening anyone? Does a child's right to a peaceful life and an inspiring environment take precedence over an addict's right to writhe and vomit in a public park so long as he is not directly harming anyone? How, in such a context, is harm even defined? This is a fundamental problem with roots in philosophy, economics, and sociology. And while the questions are not identical, they share the same core issue, the question of limits. At the basic philosophical level, it involves the paradox of the heap, which primarily concerns terminology. Consider a heap of sand and pose a simple question. If we agree that removing a single grain does not change the essence, that is, the fact that the heap remains a heap, at what point do we conclude that the activity has been repeated enough times that it can no longer be called a heap? Replace the term heap with the phrase a functional community based on objectivist principles, or utopia, and a grain of sand with a single person, and the question arises again. What would the answer be? In sociology, Charles Wright Mills poses the question of how individual problems translate into social challenges, and in the sociological imagination, he drew attention to the fact that the individual becomes the social when confronted with structural prevalence. The phrase in the book's title provides a framework for understanding individual existence and experience within the broader social order, that is, for understanding social reality. Finally, In economics, we encounter both the problem of public goods and the logic of collective action elaborated by Mansur Olson, who raises the issue of how individual irrational decisions can collectively result in harmful outcomes for the community when each person acts from a limited perspective. Thus, not only may the harm caused by the single act seem negligible, but the activity itself may appear perfectly rational, yet collectively it contributes to systemic damage. Given the premises of objectivist ideology, and as Ryan demonstrates in his speeches, no intervention would occur and the problem of drugs would spiral out of control. This is inevitable because, as can be seen from the words of objectivists we've presented, any intervention would necessarily require abandoning objectivism as a closed, coherent system. The splicers are merely a visualization of the runaway damage stemming from individual choices that initially harmed no one, yet escalated into both personal ruin and a vector of social collapse. Finally, the last point worth illuminating, which Ayn Rand's novels largely skip over, is the problem of the second generation. Imagine that everything goes smoothly. People freely enter a community pursuing their own selfish interests, generating positive externalities that benefit society as a whole, and achieving intellectual breakthroughs impossible outside that community. However, for such a model to be sustainable, reproduction must occur. At this point, part of the community consists of individuals who had no choice in joining, and, as is often the case, they represent potential agents of critique capable of questioning the order and demanding changes. Moreover, newcomers are not born with objectivist principles in their minds, they must acquire them during the process of growing up. They must, through education and perhaps conscious or unconscious acceptance, sign on to a concept that some philosophers call the social contract, which is problematic in itself. Indirectly, we can infer how Rand, through the character of John Galt, might have approached this problem, and her correspondence with her young niece Connie offers guidance. When Connie requested a loan of $25, Rand agreed on the condition that she repay it within a set period, expecting her to find a job. The essence of her response was to teach responsibility early in life. To quote, "I think that a person who asks and expects other people to give him money instead of earning it is the most rotten person on earth. I would like to teach you, if I can, very early in life, the idea of a self-respecting, self-supporting, responsible, capitalistic person. If you borrow money and repay it, it is the best training in responsibility that you can ever have." This approach to upbringing may seem reasonable to some and objectionable to others, but the latter reflects her earlier hostility toward those who deviate from her principles, even minors. Thus, it is hardly surprising that Ryan responds to the problem of the second generation with a children's amusement park and a propaganda program targeting youthful curiosity. Through the story of Ryan the Lion, a homage to Aesop's fable of the lion and the mouse, the creator of Rapture equips the new generation with a conceptual apparatus for proper living in the utopia.
Hello, children. I'm Ryan the Lion. I'm here to tell you about Peter the Parasite. If I bake a pie, isn't it mine to enjoy? No, says Peter the Parasite, we all deserve a piece. If I earn a nickel, isn't it my right to buy candy if I see fit? No, says Peter the Parasite, you must only buy fruits and vegetables. If I can afford to see the doctor, is it my concern that others cannot? No, says the damnable parasite. We must all crowd our way into the physician's office. Ryan the Lion says, chew on that, you parasite.
For some parents like Bill McDonough, such lessons provoke unease, which even Ryan himself feels when confronted with a robotic version of himself in the park. Yet, the results speak for themselves.
I know this facility is vital to the preservation of secrecy and Rapture, but seeing myself transformed into that lurching, waxen nightmare, do children truly respond to this? Still, I spoke to a young man exiting the park after the grand opening, asking him what, if anything, he had learned here. He said his chores didn't seem so bad anymore, as long as Mother wouldn't send him to the surface.
Propaganda, prohibitions, irrationality, monopolies, the rise of the corrupt, insurmountable structural inequality, and finally the brainwashing of children, all culminate in civil war when incompatible ideas and tactical alliances of swindlers, ideologues, and addicts strike at the foundations of utopia. It is precisely during this period of unrest and conflict that the enormous latent potential for evil hidden within the foundations of objectivism becomes fully apparent. It is therefore appropriate here to recall the essence of Rand's philosophy, this time expressed in the words of John Galt, echoing an earlier passage from the virtue of selfishness.
There are two sides to every issue. One side is right and the other is wrong, but the middle is always evil. The man who is wrong still retains some respect for truth, if only by accepting the responsibility of choice. But the man in the middle is the knave who blanks out the truth in order to pretend that no choice or values exist, who is willing to sit out the course of any battle, willing to cash in on the blood of the innocent or to crawl on his belly to the guilty, who dispenses justice by condemning both the robber and the robbed to jail, who solves conflicts by ordering the thinker and the fool to meet each other halfway. In any compromise between food and poison, it is only death that can win. In any compromise between good and evil, it is only evil that can profit. In that transfusion of blood which drains the good to feed the evil, the compromiser is the transmitting rubber tube.
The absolutism of black and white thinking leaves no room for disagreement, uncertainty, incomplete information, or even perspectives that recognize the flaws of opposing sides. To use objectivist terminology, this is absolute evil in reasoning. BioShock recognizes this clearly, illuminating the outcome of such logic by placing it within a zone of conflict for the sake of dramatization.
I couldn't believe how much things had changed since I left Dr. Steinman's office. It's like I don't even recognize Rapture no more. I hear they've been rounding up people in Power Square. I asked Ryan how could he do such things to innocents. He said, innocents. If they haven't chosen to defend Rapture, they've chosen to side with Atlas and his bandits. So there are no innocents. There are heroes, and there are criminals.
Turbulent times bring mass arrests of both parasites and an even worse category, those who remain neutral. This is the endpoint of the dehumanization and demonization of dissenters. The aim of this thorough examination of Ayn Rand's thought, her artistic rendering of her own principles, the history of her movement, and the ways in which Ryan embodies the essence of this ideology, along with the steps by which Rapture gradually marches toward destruction, has been to illuminate the evident unscientific nature of the creator of objectivism. This can be reduced to the following. Without questioning objective reality itself, we must acknowledge that, from our current perspective, there is no criterion of objectivity other than that which includes intersubjective verifiability and falsifiability. Without denying appearances, we must also recognize the need to examine the inherent limitations of our senses and cognitive capacities as the only tools through which we can apprehend reality. That is where the crux of the matter lies, and such a perspective allows us to navigate between the scylla of complete subjectivization and relativism and the Charybdis of naive objectivization through the idea of the observer's pure independence and direct access to reality as it is. Returning to the dichotomy of savagery and evil, even if we accept the idea that thinkers with whom Rand disagrees can be placed in the latter category, it is precisely the former group that reveals how little she understands the nature of the human mind and social reality. Let us recall her hostility toward indigenous peoples and her justification of their extermination as reflected in the thoughts of Dagny Taggart.
But they She looked at the face of her signal engineer. They believed that that muscular contraction of a hand was the only thing required to move the traffic. And now the tower men stood idle. And on the great panels in front of the tower director, the red and green lights, which had flashed announcing the progress of trains at a distance of miles, were now so many glass beads, like the glass beads for which another breed of savages had once sold the island of Manhattan.
In this excerpt and in the broader view of tribal societies, there lies the idea of self-created thought and identity. It is as if Rand herself arrived at the understanding of reason or the notion of a community based on it, which in reality emerges from centuries of social development shaped by forces that are not immediately visible. How can we hate a person who does not know about electricity when he is shaped by life in a community where the conditions for a combination of individual genius, happy circumstances, and God knows what else have not been acquired, but which would have illuminated the mentioned phenomena? Despite her idealization of rationality, which merely echoes Enlightenment enthusiasm, the only accurate way to interpret it is biologically. A general look at the behavior of the Khoisan people, also known as Bushmen, illustrates this point. This group is known for its extraordinary planning and anticipation in harsh, arid conditions, both for water shortages and the movements of prey. They read the paths that animals have taken based on old tracks in the sand, plan hunting tactics before even seeing their target, and store water in cleaned ostrich eggs hidden under the ground along hunting routes, ensuring they will not be caught unprepared if the area they traverse is parched. This is an undeniable reflection of the rationality that Rand so admires, but a rationality that is constrained by numerous other limitations, as with any other member of Homo sapiens. Therefore, her foolish vision of the fate of savages who lived like animals reveals a lack of understanding even of this pinnacle of human cognitive ability, alongside the already discussed misunderstanding of social reality. BioShock's creators play with this question of prudence, aware of this flaw in Rand's reasoning, giving us one of the most striking scenes in video gaming history. Let us then assess who is truly a man and who is nothing more but a slave.
They told me, son, you're special. You were born to do great things. You know what? They were right.
If we take a look at the content of the introductory video, we notice a few interesting elements. The first thing we observe about Jack, synchronized with the first thought we hear, is a cigarette. Immediately after that comes a picture of the protagonist and his parents, which he gently strokes with his thumb. Jack then lifts a gift on which a message is written, containing, among other things, the phrase, "Would you kindly?" Throughout, we hear his voice, marking both the first and the last time we hear our hero's thoughts. In the later scenes, another detail catches our eye, barely visible in the airplay shots: the chain tattoos on both of his arms. In these few moments, we actually find a wealth of information crucial for understanding the rest of the narrative, or rather for re-examining objectivist ideology. However, for a full grasp of these elements, we must supplement what has already been said with one more postulate of objectivist ethics: the virtue of rationality. In the words of the author herself, the virtue of rationality means the recognition and acceptance of reason as one's only source of knowledge, one's only judge of values, and one's only guide to action. It means one's total commitment to a state of full, conscious awareness, to the maintenance of a full mental focus in all issues, in all choices, in all of one's waking hours. It means a commitment to the principle that all of one's convictions, values, goals, desires, and actions must be based on, derived from, chosen, and validated by a process of thought, as precious and scrupulous a process of thought, directed by a ruthlessly strict application of logic as one's fullest capacity permits. It means that one must never sacrifice one's convictions to the opinions or wishes of others, which is the virtue of integrity. that one must never attempt to fake reality in any manner, which is the virtue of honesty, that one must never seek or grant the unearned and undeserved, neither in matter nor in spirit, which is the virtue of justice. It means that one must never desire effects without causes, and that one must never enact a cause without assuming full responsibility for its effects, that one must never act like a zombie, that is, without knowing one's own purpose and motives, that one must never make any decisions, form any convictions, or seek any values out of context, that is, apart from or against the total, integrated sum of one's knowledge, and above all, that one must never seek to get away with contradictions. Thus, as we can see from the above, her primary concern lies in unconscious, automized existence. This may sound reasonable and acceptable, yet we must still question the height of the standard that this so-called virtue demands of a human being. Despite all the claims that objectivism is the only doctrine to fully reject mysticism, I would argue that the conception of reason implied in the subtext of this definition clearly expresses a conceptual mystification of human cognitive capacities. Rand herself, in order to outline her utopia and develop her argument, must create superhuman figures such as Galt and Rourke, invoke their thoughts in her philosophical writings, and then, as the crowning point of her argument, claim that the proof such people exist is the fact that she wrote a book. Given that mysticism appeals to the supernatural and the imperceptible, her reliance on the giants of her own imagination can be nothing more than that. Moreover, she constructs her entire argument not to demonstrate how human beings actually behave and how reason functions in reality, but how people ought to behave and think, taking these characters as the standard, in other words, taking her own imagination as the source of authority. Who then can be surprised by the expulsion of members from her movement for violating her notions proclaimed as objective reality? Thus, despite its rhetorical rationalism, her argument depends on fictional, perfect individuals. She avoids firm evidence in her claims about the nature of both reality and human cognitive capacities. She primarily criticizes the opposing side without referencing their actual arguments. She does not engage in debates with other philosophers, insisting instead on the corruption and detachment of the academic world from reality, and speaking of the villains of intellectual history. Taken together, this renders her claims ideological rather than philosophical, while her so-called values become unattainable and, in essence, mystical. Of course, none of this implies that even if her argument were perfectly rational, such a worldview would constitute a correct philosophy, nor that her standard of perfection corresponds to any objective conception of perfection. I may be repeating myself, but I would once again draw a parallel with Dostoyevsky, that is, with his approach to shaping his characters. The very zeal for emphasizing the rationality of the human race is a phenomenon far older than Rand. It emerged as a force that broke the constraints and mystifications of previous centuries, opening vast space for the development of humanity. We have seen in the case of Tsiolkovsky and Vernadsky, mentioned in the discussion of monolith in Stalker, what their relationship to it was, and the two of them belonged to the intellectual elite that shaped the world of education and science in which Rand formed her view of reality. Yet, like anything else, at a certain point, through the excessive insistence of its proponents, this perspective turns into a force that conceals more than it reveals. This was already evident to figures like Dostoevsky in the 19th century, and with the development of science today, it is, one would think, entirely clear to us. Therefore, we might turn to the thoughts of one of the characters drawn by the great Russian literary master. You see, gentlemen, reason is an excellent thing, there's no disputing that. But reason is nothing but reason, and satisfies only the rational side of man's nature, while will is a manifestation of the whole life, that is, of the whole human life, including reason and all the impulses. And although our life, in this manifestation of it, is often worthless, yet it is life and not simply extracting square roots. Here I, for instance, quite naturally want to live in order to satisfy all my capacities for life, and not simply my capacity for reasoning, that is, not simply 1/20th of my capacity for life. What does reason know? Reason only knows what it has succeeded in learning, some things perhaps it will never learn. This is a poor comfort, but why not say so frankly? And human nature acts as a whole, with everything that is in it, consciously or unconsciously, and even if it goes wrong, it lives. The discussion of the rationality of the human species is relevant to us because BioShock should not be read merely as a critique of Ayn Rand's utopia, but also as an attack on the treatment of reason as infallible and self-justifying. For instead of the idea that reason is an absolute whose denial destroys civilizations, as Rand attributes to Kant, the game shows that its absolutization likewise leads to disintegration precisely because appealing to it is taken as a sufficient argument in justifying evidently flawed actions. This brings us to the first interesting detail in the aforementioned video, the cigarette. If it did not catch your attention on the first reading, a return to Ayn Rand's novels will reveal the specific role cigarettes play within them. She indulges in the aesthetic of the image of heroes enjoying tobacco, portrayed as a reflection of sophistication, rebellion, and independence. Rand thus frames this image within a narrative of human exceptionalism, presenting even the chains that enslave man as golden necklaces he wears with pride.
I like cigarettes, Miss Taggart. I like to think of fire held in a man's hand. Fire, a dangerous force, tamed at his fingertips. I often wonder about the hours when a man sits alone, watching the smoke of a cigarette, thinking. I wonder what great things have come from such hours. When a man thinks, there is a spot of fire alive in his mind. And it is proper that he should have the burning point of a cigarette as his one expression.
From this, we clearly see that the sheer, unquestionable irrationality of poisoning oneself and one's surrounding is wrapped in the colorful paper of exceptionalism and profound thought, something that BioShock's opening sequence itself demonstrates. Rand herself was such an admirer of tobacco that she often posed with a cigarette in photographs. Yet she went a step further, claiming, when asked about cyclamates, that there was no serious evidence of harm either for it or from cigarettes, although she did concede that, in the case of tobacco, opinions are more divided, adding nonetheless that we hear only the negative side. More interesting than that, however, is her view of the origin of the attacks on these two. To quote, "If you want my hypothesis on why this is done, that comes from the psychology of attacking capitalism. Observe, it's attacking any industry which gives people help or pleasure and which makes money for somebody. Not only is enslavement to an addictive substance presented through the lens of some supposed rationality, but serious warnings are also reduced to alleged attacks on capitalism. This is a Bolshevik-style mechanism of reasoning, one for one, merely painted in different colors, fully consistent with everything we have discussed so far, while also reflecting the phenomenon of psychological rationalization. I do not believe that her worldview changed in the slightest, even after in 1974 she had to undergo lung cancer surgery. And precisely such a fate serves as evidence that, through her own supposedly rational behavior, she called into question the highest value, her own life. In fact, the act of smoking itself points to a fundamental flaw in her line of reasoning, one that attempts to graft itself onto the objectivity of nature. In asserting that the standard by which the human body evaluates the validity of actions is, in fact, its own life, Rand states, "The pleasure-pain mechanism in the body of man, and in the bodies of all the living organisms that possess the faculty of consciousness, serves as an automatic guardian of the organism's life. The physical sensation of pleasure is a signal indicating that the organism is pursuing the right course of action. It would be irrational to doubt that her own organism was sending her signals of pleasure, thus of the correctness of consuming tobacco, while killing her more and more each day. Therein lies the obvious flaw of her mechanistic rationalism. Even if we were to say that she succumbed to the irrationality of tobacco use, we would still be left with the fact that her towering heroes, perfectly rational and moral as they are all, without exception, smokers. This means that smoking is not merely a matter of personal weakness, but a deliberate reflection on exceptionalism. In this way, BioShock shows us, from its very first scene, a deviation from the virtue of rationality illuminating small, everyday actions for which none of us seek a reason or explanation, nor thinks about too much, except when they begin to show negative consequences. And even then, most people are not capable of simply using reason to overcome a need that did not originally exist, but was produced through repeated, everyday exposure to this addictive substance, grounded in everything except rational conclusion. I am also fairly certain that her successors were aware of this because, in the book Ayn Rand Answers, you will not find the quote I cited above, even though both the question and part of the answer from that interview are presented. This only testifies to the intention to create an idealized image of the author who, like all of us, was marked by various shortcomings, and thus also speaks to an intention to distort reality. In the game, cigarettes appear as a consumable item, accompanied by a note. A pack of cigarettes will give you a very small boost of Eve. Warning, may cause health complications, while in practice they do, in fact, reduce your health. However, they are often found in piles of other resources, and it is the glimmer that attracts attention, so most of us probably rarely even notice that we have picked up tobacco at all. Our focus on the challenges we face in missions, on the narrative coming through the radio or audio logs, or on the steps we need to take through the rest of the level, often obscures our awareness of what we have collected. In this way, the cigarette in the game represents a small but regular irrationality or automatism in behavior, so unmistakably human and therefore so unmistakably Randian. Having said that, we can see that Ayn Rand made several major errors in her understanding of rationality. Given that her philosophy declaratively gives primacy to reality over imagination and sweeping assumptions, the chain of reasoning could be viewed as a sequence moving from reality through the senses and logic to truth. Due to the absolutization of the idea that contradictions do not exist, the necessary conclusion is that correct reasoning must lead to correct conclusions. On the other hand, if we follow a line of thought closer to Kuhn or Popper, we might instead say that the chain runs from reality through the senses and models to provisional conclusions, and it is precisely in this second framework that we leave room for a range of problems that Rand simply overlooks. Given the supposed primacy of objective reality, ignoring the objective characteristics of the human mind in favor of emphasizing an idealized rationality constitutes a violation of her own postulate, one that receives its artistic treatment in the most famous scene in BioShock and perhaps in video gaming history in general. But let us gradually unpack this. The perspective shared by Rand and Ryan remains blind to several things. First, they fail to notice what we might call the problem of information and perfect rationality. Second, they completely miss the relativistic understanding of rationality, as well as the earlier mentioned distinction between biological and idealistic interpretations. Finally, they remain blind to the nature and character of the senses through which rationality is supplied with information, as well as to the question of the relationship between rationality and emotions. To better understand this, let us ask ourselves the following question. Is it rational for Jack to enter the bathysphere? As far as I'm concerned, the answer is not obvious. If we set aside the simplistic comment that this is a condition for the unfolding of the story, we can try to view this choice from the perspective of the protagonist himself. On the one hand, it is clear that the probability of survival in the lighthouse is virtually non-existent due to coldness, the lack of food and water, and the unlikelihood of being found anytime soon. On the other hand, it is not clear where the bathysphere leads, nor whether it is even functional. By entering it, we risk an even worse death in the darkness of the ocean depths. We later come to realize that there is, in fact, some kind of system beneath the waves, yet what greets us is fear, darkness, death, and ruin. And yet, since we discover all of this only afterward, at the level of the initial decision we see that Jack is gambling by choosing to dissent. Already here the choice departs from the process Rand envisions, because the kind of rational assessment she imagines is not possible under conditions of shock and near total ignorance of the situation in which we find ourselves. However, does that gamble make his decision rational or irrational in a more conventional sense? And what would determine it as such? I believe arguments can be made for both, but to understand all the nuances of the problem, we can shift it to a domain closer to us. Imagine a person burdened by a severe illness given the opportunity to try a drug whose effects are not fully known. If they do not take it, death is almost certain. If they do take it, survival is not guaranteed. Already here we notice that the potential for survival in the second case does not arise from the inherent properties of the drug, but from our lack of information about the outcome, which makes it imagined rather than an objective potential. Now, imagine our perspective sometime after the moment when that individual had to make the decision, once a series of trials has shown that the mortality rate from using the drug is 100%. That is, it not only fails to help but actually harms. From that perspective, it is clear that choosing the drug was not a rational move. However, at the moment of decision, this could not have been known. This tells us that even if we had a perfectly rational being, it could not govern its life in the manner Rand envisions, because the problem of missing or incomplete information would inevitably distort outcomes, leading agents from the outset onto a mistaken or irrational path. Subsequent adjustments based on rational conclusions might in some cases be possible, but new unknowns would inevitably arise ones we cannot even anticipate. Thus, relativity is inherent to a limited perspective, and certain death from a later viewpoint may appear as a potential for survival from an earlier one. The same choice is qualified different at two different moments. This reveals the phenomena of relative rationality, that is, the lowering of our gaze from an idealized concept to contextually conditioned reasoning based on available information, but also through a contextually conditioned apparatus shaped by different life experiences. This in turn means that perfectly rational reasoning in the previous example, based on the information available at the time, leads to certain death, that is, to an incorrect outcome from the standpoint of our survival. But notice another, rather bleak yet no less important fact. By choosing to try the drug and through the individual's inevitable death, the community gains because it acquires knowledge that alters the set of information at its disposal, increasing the likelihood that the actions of future agents will produce a positive result. Someone unfortunate enough to suffer the same illness, yet fortunate that it occurs somewhat later, would find themselves in a far more favorable position, one in which their choice would not be the result of their own feverish reasoning, but a rapid decision based on the fact that so many others who initially took that path lost their lives, allowing the system to adapt. So, what then makes actions rational? Well, our assessment of rationality at a given moment, not inevitable knowability or inherent truth. That is the essence of relativism, not the nihilistic and criminal ramblings of the villains in Rand's novels. This is why the disdain she expresses toward indigenous peoples speaking from a position of superiority reflects a deep irrationality and a corruption of thought. For she did not invent the concept of property rights. Rather, she was born into a world shaped by a vast sea of social experiments, conflicts, cooperation, exceptional individuals, some beneficial overall, others harmful, as well as countless other elements which together produced a system in which such a category became evident and which, through education and socialization, passed it on to her. But let us return to Jack. Having descended to Rapture and witnessed the scene in which a splicer tears out the guts of a terrified man, the protagonist hears the voice of the revolutionary Atlas. Although we later come to understand the true nature of the phrase "would you kindly," the question remains relevant. Is it rational to follow Atlas's words? I believe the answer is yes, because within the informational world available to us, his voice stands in contrast to the spectacle of death and darkness surrounding Jack. The murder scene leaves its mark on us as well as beings of flesh and blood in the real world by striking our emotions, by awakening fear of what might emerge from the darkness. In this way, the narrative highlights the role of emotions in decision-making, even when we are in the perfectly safe conditions of our own room. We see not only the irrationality of fearing the non-existent, but also the flawed relationship between the senses, which send us distressing signals, and the mind, which ought to know that we are safe. The heart races whether we want it to or not, yet it also reminds us of the mechanisms that belong to the instinct for survival and have little to do with the virtue of rationality as Rand presents it. Atlas understands this and thus feeds us a story about Patrick and Moira, leading us into genuine sympathy when, in faint shock, he cries out upon seeing that the submarine supposedly carrying members of his family has been destroyed. Rand, as an artist, should have understood this, for, as we have said earlier, there is no doubt that her work served as a source of inspiration, even, if you will, of spiritual energy, helping many people emerge from lethargy and confront life's hardships. But consider how irrational it is to find inspiration in characters that do not exist in objective reality. How irrational and humanly beautiful it is to fuel actions in objective reality with emotion nourished by imagination. This opens yet another major problem in her perspective, the rejection of emotions in the account of rationality and decision-making, as well as an evident misunderstanding of the nature of human senses. We have seen in our example the relationship between the senses and the mind, but we have also observed that the author attributes emotionality to the villains of her novels, so that standard relativization employed by apologists of objectivism, that we have misunderstood Rand, does not hold here. Our perception of reality is a variant of a model conditioned by our evolutionary path and the conditions under which we developed as a species. Seeing time as linear and the sky as something above us has proven to be an excellent model for building educational systems or skyscrapers, yet it is of little help in understanding more complex cosmic phenomena. In this light, we should also consider Kant's idea that the thing in itself remains unknowable, that our knowledge of reality and reality itself are not the same, because the former is mediated by limited senses and mental structures that produce the latter. The Prussian philosopher did not deny reality, nor did he reject knowledge or reason. Rather, he sought to explain how we come to know reality. Of course, neither Kant nor Rand provides fully scientific answers, but it is clear that contemporary science retains elements of Kantian restraint, even if it does not accept the entire system, and that Rand, despite all that can be objected to in Kant, is primarily arguing with a straw man rather than with the philosopher himself. On the other hand, we have observed that even when we experience a scene in the game multiple times and know what awaits us, our skin often begins to tingle on its own, something especially pronounced the first time we pass through those segments, yet even more fascinating when it occurs despite our attempts to suppress it through sheer force of mind, based on our knowledge of the situation. This is a captivating phenomenon, as it testifies to an automatism that cannot simply be overridden by conscious awareness. If we combine these observations, we must view emotions as a form of cognition, though not in the sense Rand describes it, yet certainly as necessary for sound reasoning. Even if they should not be overestimated, it is clear that a human being without emotions would not correspond to our concept of normality. Indeed, one might argue that such a being would not survive at all. From this perspective, we may also call into question the dualism of emotion and reason that Rand employs in shaping her characters and arguments, even as she rejects the dualism of soul and matter. The very fact that she speaks in categories of duality once again reflects the previously mentioned phenomenon of the relationship between our senses and reality, as well as the framing of her worldview within a domain matrix of thinking about such questions. A clear example familiar to all of us would be our perception of time and space as separate, even though modern physics has shown the obsolescence of such a model, employing instead the concept of space-time as a four-dimensional continuum, though it must be admitted that even this model remains open to question and does not provide a final answer. Overcoming such constraints is difficult, though not impossible, and thus the question remains: how much strength would it take to truly fulfill the virtue of rationality? Returning to the earlier problem of the relationship between reason and emotion, further support for what we have said can be found in the work of the Portuguese neuroscientist Antonio Damasio, who in his book Descartes' Error shows that individuals who have suffered damage to the part of the brain responsible for emotions retain the capacity for rational thought, expressed through the ability to perform mathematical calculations, yet lose the potential for practical rationality. Despite having access to information and logic, they ultimately become unable to determine priorities among facts, which in turn results in their failing for scams. For although they know they are dealing with fraudsters, they also know that the offers are attractive, and this inability to prioritize renders them practically incapable. Beyond emotions, however, another factor is crucial, one that becomes fully apparent only once we discover who Atlas really is, and which arises from an imbalance of information. Even perfect rationality does not, in itself, represent an unquestionable source of a just outcome, because the one who possesses more complete information, in our case Atlas, has a tremendous advantage over the one who does not, namely Jack. This is especially true given that Jack finds himself in a completely new world and in distress. Under such conditions, a simple question arises. What exactly prevents the one with the advantage from abusing it, thereby exercising a form of power? How exactly does reason prevent power from playing a role in decision-making, especially if we again consider the phenomenon of psychological rationalization, which Rand herself demonstrated in the case of tobacco? If we take as examples individuals who are perfectly rational, such as Rourke and Galt, can we conclude that it would then be proper for the one who has access to information that others, due to circumstances, do not possess, to first disclose everything to their opponents and only then strive to defeat them? For surely it would be better for that person to take the more difficult path, since it would force them to think more deeply and exert greater effort, especially since this abundance of information is not the result of greater diligence, reflection, or anything of that sort, but of factors unrelated to them, mere chance. It sounds absurd, doesn't it? Rand offers no answer to this, and we are left looking like complete naives once we hear the malicious gloating of Frank Fontaine. It is precisely the phrase "would you kindly" that plays a dual role here, speaking both about ourselves and about the imbalance of power among the actors. On the one hand, it points to a series of mental shortcomings that characterize each of us. On the other, it leads to a non-mechanistic understanding of the phenomenon of power. To understand the first claim, we can reflect on our own experience of the introductory video before we knew how the story unfolds. The fact that Jack gently caresses the photograph of his parents, the presence of the gift before him, and finally the fact that his thoughts speak of parents who told him he was special and that he himself accepted the idea that he was destined for great deeds, all of this plays on our mental shortcuts, that is, on the representativeness heuristic and the halo effect. These few details serve as fuel for the part of our mind that seeks to fit every situation into a pattern, searching for causal connections and attempting to draw indirect conclusions about things that are entirely unknown to it. Seeing the gift, the sentiment with which Jack strokes the photograph, and hearing his thoughts about supportive parents, we construct an image based on the similarity of this setup to the stereotypical notion of good parenting. What a shock we experience upon realizing that nothing justified our conclusions, that Jack is genetically Ryan's son, yet his mother and Ryan's lover, Jasmine Jolene, chose to sell him due to financial hardship. On the other hand, we also learn that these memories are false and that the child is a product of a sinister alliance between the criminal Fontaine and the autistic yet brilliant former Nazi collaborator, Brigitte Tannenbaum. Thus, both the biological and sociological parents of the protagonist Jack are moral wrecks, leaving us with a warning about the fallibility of the automized mental mechanism that attempts to construct a more complete picture. Shifting the perspective to the broader discussion of the characteristics of the human mind, this subsequent reassembly of information into a coherent whole, one that departs from the original image, points to conclusions about the existence of two systems of thinking. The work of psychologists Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky sheds light on the complex rationality of human beings, what we earlier referred to as the biological as opposed to the idealized conception, which takes into account a range of flaws that characterize us. But before we turn to this question, let us see what Galt says about the human mind.
To think is an act of choice. The key to what you so recklessly call human nature, the open secret you live with, yet dread to name, is the fact that man is a being of volitional consciousness. Reason does not work automatically. Thinking is not a mechanical process. The connections of logic are not made by instinct. The function of your stomach, lungs, or heart is automatic. The function of your mind is not. In any hour and issue of your life, You are free to think or to evade that effort. But you are not free to escape from your nature, from the fact that reason is your means of survival. So that for you, who are a human being, the question to be or not to be is the question to think or not to think.
Oh, how mistaken he is. It is true that the mind is humanity's primary tool for survival, but precisely because an entire segment of the processes it performs is automated. This is exactly what the previously mentioned division into two systems points to. Systems that should be understood strictly as conceptual models, not as a literal division within the brain, as Kahneman himself emphasizes. System 1 is thus the intuitive part of the mind, a fast and automatic process of thinking that is highly efficient, yet prone to biases and shortcuts that can lead to unjustified conclusions. In contrast, System 2 represents a slow and deliberate process of thinking responsible for complex reasoning, calculations, and logic. Although these two systems interact depending on the context and the challenges we face, System 2 often accepts the narrative about the world constructed by System 1 without thoroughly examining the details. Why is that so? Because of the cost we would pay if we relied solely on System 2. We simply would not survive the sluggishness of decision-making and the overload of the infinite sea of information that every context brings. Does that mean System 1 is illogical? Of course not. Rather, we might call it protological, given that it mimics logical structures. Let us return to the problem of the parents. System 1 leads us to conclusion that Jack is the product of the sincere love of two people who care for him, with the gift playing a significant role in that inference. However, this shortcut rests on a simple syllogism rooted in our experience. Good parents give gifts, Jack received a gift from his parents, therefore Jack has good parents. Perfectly logical and yet untrue. And although System 1 does not produce conscious syllogisms, it produces results that can later be rationalized as if they were. System 1 seeks coherence, not truth, just as Ayn Rand's own System 1 sought to align her inclination toward tobacco or the expulsion of dissenters from her movement with the narrative she constructed about people and the world. These shortcuts are constantly at work within us. The sugar-coated perception of Jack's origins, as well as the confidence with which he reflects, pushes us toward unfounded conclusions, and I doubt many players genuinely ask themselves why his voice is heard only in the introductory video and never again. The answer, I believe, is twofold. First, due to the conditioning of our perception, and second, as a depiction of the fact that after the plane crashes, Jack no longer possesses independent thoughts. In the first case, the parents' words about his special nature, along with his internalization of them, serve as the basis for explaining all his later feats. We do not question why Atlas relies on him, why he so successfully overcomes every obstacle, or how he passes through situations others cannot. The absence of subsequent thoughts and commentary allows us to fill in the story ourselves, interpreting the masterful exploits of our hero, thereby leaving us blind to the information we gather along the way, information that reveals crucial details. I am aware that I listened word for word to Sullivan's comments about the bathyspheres, and yet it never occurred to me to question the fact that Jack uses them without difficulty. The creators of the game constantly give us opportunities to demonstrate pure rationality, leaving behind clues, yet the question is how many of us can truly claim to have noticed where things were heading. It is precisely in these opportunities that the brilliance of the counterarguments to objectivist assumptions lies, because nothing manages to override the fabricated story of parents and origin. There is no difference between Jack and us in that regard. Listen to what we find in an audio log fairly early in the game.
We're putting all the bathyspheres in lockdown until further notice. Ryan had us install some kind of genetic device into the thing, so only Ryan and his inner circle will be able to use them without dispensation. But the boys tell me the keys are pretty unreliable. Sisters, cousins, anybody in the ballpark genetically will be able to come and go as they see fit.
Although sons are not mentioned, we could certainly infer what is happening. On the other hand, later we encounter a recording of Jasmine Jolene, Jack's biological mother, which offers another hint.
That creepy Dr. Tenenbaum promised me it wasn't going to be a real pregnancy. They just take the egg out once Mr. Ryan and I had... Well, I needed the money so bad. But I know Mr. Ryan's going to suss it out. Gonna know I wasn't being careful. Gonna know I sold the... Mr. Ryan's going to be so mad at me.
And yet, we continue as if none of this exists. On the other hand, the absence of Jack's thoughts combined with Atlas's constant voice and the arrow hovering above us, continuously indicating where to go, serves as an echo of the fact that Jack is not an independent agent. The arrow itself can be understood within the framework of nudging, as described by Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein, which relies on the very mental shortcuts we have discussed, and is in fact directed at us, players. Of course, the type of conditioning present in Jack represents an artistic dramatization intended to highlight the message more clearly, the futility of objectivist rationalism. Still, it is worth recalling the point mentioned in the video on Stalker about the monolith, related to Soviet scientific efforts at mind control, which had their counterpart in the United States in the form of the MKUltra project. Although such endeavors have failed, at least for now, BioShock also introduces a subplot involving pheromones intended for mind control, constructing it as a reflection of fear of the other's victory rather than inherent evil. This, in fact, shows the path by which an imbalance of power combined with justified unease stemming from ignorance of others' intentions can unfold. Finally, Jack's memories remain as a warning about the fallibility of our own memory, which inevitably shapes our conclusions and decisions in later stages of life. After all, they are not a complete record of facts, but a reconstruction of events. Research by scientists such as Elizabeth Loftus demonstrates that this forms the basis both for the existence of false memories and for their manipulation through suggestive questions, careful phrasing, or context. This phenomenon has even entered popular discourse through one of its manifestations, known as the Mandela effect. A common example is Star Wars. Darth Vader says, "Luke, I am your father," does he not? Be that as it may, the phrase "would you kindly," together with the previously mentioned imbalance of information, also opens the way toward a non-mechanistic understanding of power, one that introduces into the analysis of human relations a concept impossible within the objectivist framework, the notion of non-decision. For unlike Rand, where every actor makes a decision, however mistaken, and where power manifests as coercion that negates reason, Jack's experience with Atlas reveals a phenomenon that the British sociologist Stephen Lukes calls the third dimension of power. Its essence can be reduced to the idea that one actor controls the conditions in which another finds themselves, such that the latter is not even aware of their own interests and therefore cannot feel dissatisfaction when those interests are unmet, resulting in the absence of conflict between actors. To quote directly, "To put the matter sharply, A may exercise power over B by getting him to do what he does not want to do, but he also exercises power over him by influencing, shaping, or determining his very wants. Indeed, is it not the supreme exercise of power to get another or others to have the desires you want them to have, that is, to secure their compliance by controlling their thoughts and desires? One does not have to go to the lengths of talking about Brave New World or the world of B.F. Skinner to see this. Thought control takes many less total and more mundane forms through the control of information, through the mass media, and through the process of socialization. Would you kindly is not merely the trigger of Jack's literal conditioning, but also a metaphorical reflection of his socialization and ours as well. We expect polite communication from polite people and thus lower our guard in the face of such expressions. Atlas feeds us carefully selected information, effectively keeping us in the dark, directing our hatred toward Ryan and our sympathy toward the supposedly oppressed people he leads, so that we are in no better position than Jack himself. Atlas exercises power over us. All of this brings us to the chain tattoos. Like Ryan's idea of the Great Chain, these markings serve as a homage to the second chapter of the first part of Atlas Shrugged, titled The Chain. If we were to summarize everything said so far, it becomes clear that this metaphor is significant both because of the historical conditioning of thought, shaped by existing paradigms, and because of the third dimension of power and one's position within the social structure. Yet this conditioning extends to the biological level as well, to the nature of our senses and cognitive apparatus. The symbolism is more than fitting, testifying to Jack's conditioning by forces unrelated to his will. At the same time, the tattoos function as a visual reflection of the arguments developed throughout the narrative of the game, dismantling Rand's initial premise with which we began, namely, the idea of a rationally processed and accepted influence. The tattoos are in fact a visual reminder of causal or structural influence tied to all the elements of Ryan's utopia and human nature. This is echoed in the audio logs where Pete Wilkins, one of Fontaine's smugglers, points to the relativity of the perception of the chain, reflecting the problem of one's position within a structure which conditions susceptibility to populists and fraudsters like Fontaine.
We all come down here. Figured we all be part of Ryan's great chain. Turns out Ryan's chain is made of gold, and ours are the sort with the big iron ball around your ankle. He's up in Fort Frolic banging fashion models. We're down in this dump yanking guts out of fish. Fontaine's promising something better. He's like one of us, you know, like he's worked a day in his life. He says meet him at his fish packing joint at 11. I'll go, bring a couple of guys. Hey, it's not like things could get a lot worse.
Finally, we arrive at the most striking scene in the series, perhaps the best proof of the artistic potential of video games. Upon entering Ryan's office, we encounter the creator of Rapture who, all the while playing golf, poses a simple question and offers an answer.
In the end, what separates a man from a slave? Money? Power? No. A man chooses. A slave obeys.
In that moment, we come to understand the full truth of our origin and realize that we are nothing more than puppets in Fontaine's hands. The raw intelligence of Andrew Ryan, the very force that created Rapture, reveals to us through a complex network of interactions among various actors, one we could have deciphered ourselves through the audio logs, though we did not, what our path truly was, from inception through conditioning to the fateful flight and the lighthouse. However, an interesting twist emerges here. By using a conditioning phrase, Ryan forces Jack into actions that are not expressions of his own will. This is not merely a display of his desire to reveal the truth, but also a microcosm of Rapture's fate. Everything we have described in the previous chapters shows that a proponent of free choice in creating his utopia became a specter of determinism, restricting the freedom of choice of every one of its inhabitants through the inevitable rules of the community. Because the very definition of freedom, in order to be functional in some state-building or social sense, must be paradoxical. It must limit freedom, always standing on the brink of further minor regulations that can quickly spiral out of control. Yet this is not all, for a new paradox arises in what follows. All this theatricality stems from the unyielding spirit of Andrew Ryan, who refuses to leave the stage at the will and whim of another, and by choosing death seeks to affirm his own principles. Yet, it is clear that he chooses how, but not whether he will depart, thereby opening the question of the nature of choice itself. Is it truly free or merely a performance within a deterministic order? And yet, the greatest strength of this setup lies in the summation of the system's stubborn closeness. At the very moment when determinism, manifested in the form of the protagonist, is literally striking him in the face, Ryan does not cease to insist on the existence of choice, reaching a tragicomical climax in the utterance, "obey," before the final blow. all the sorrow stems from the fact that the clearly subordinate actor, the one who is disappearing from the stage, continues to perform the role of the master. And all of this stands in contrast to the intricate detective-like web of relations among the actors, which testifies to the incredible power of reason, only for it to ultimately enslave itself through an ideological belief in complete rationality and freedom. The scene is therefore an absolute masterpiece, because through the first concrete portrayal of Ryan's character, it reveals the full complexity of human beings who simply cannot be reduced to basic patterns. However, it would be wrong to conclude that the game's ultimate argument is that everything is predetermined and that there is no escape. For by defeating Ryan and Fontaine, Jack liberates not only himself but also Rapture, lifting from its shoulders the burden of the existence of two exceptional but not necessarily admirable individuals. Thus, the symbolism of the tattoos evolves into proof of the broken chains of a former slave who, through his own effort and with the help of others, ultimately attains his freedom. Here, the previously mentioned relativism of perception manifests once again, as the very same tattoo is interpreted in two opposing ways. And given that the liberation of the Little Sisters is considered a canonical ending, and that I personally prefer it, we may also say that the tattoos represent a chain of continuity which, in the form of effort, knowledge, and memory, stretches through time, making us a successful species. The struggle of our parents and caretakers ensures our survival while we are weak. The knowledge and virtues they pass on enable us to face life's hardships once we become agents ourselves, and to further develop and transmit them to new generations. And the memories of their dedication inspire us to support them when, with inevitable decline, they themselves become weak, serving as both inspiration and a source of warmth once they are gone. Thus, the wrinkled hand of the protagonist on his deathbed, touched by the many hands of the former Little Sisters, serves as a reminder of the true nature of the great chain, the continuity of our species through time and space. Neither pure freedom nor pure determinism, neither black nor white, but shades of gray, a complex symbiosis. The entire discussion about rationality and the human mind actually reveals the strangest twist in the interpretation of the highest good in objectivist philosophy. Namely, the teleological chain of its ethics would appear as follows. Objective reality exists independently of us and shapes human nature. Man is a rational being, and reason is therefore the sole tool for human functioning and survival. Through reason, man perceives objective reality and undertakes actions based on a value system aligned with these two, which makes an action worthwhile only if it does not falsify truth. The ultimate outcome of this, and the highest good in objectivist worldview, is happiness. And here a new problem arises. We have seen that the communication between reality and the human mind is not as clean and direct as Rand presents it. We have seen that the very nature of the mind is not as she portrays it, and therefore the values the mind defines cannot be identical for every person, meaning we cannot so easily speak of objective values. Moreover, we are free to question whether the mind determines values, or whether the random flow of evolution produces behavior that proves optimal under given conditions, to which the mind then, upon becoming aware, attributes certain meaning and logic. Yet, even if we fully accept her ideas, the starting point of such a framework, taking happiness as the supreme value, undermines them. For in doing so, we are actually incorporating the most relative and irrational phenomena into a discussion of the objective and rational. As we saw in the video on Stalker, happiness represents an irrational reward that often inhibits action and thought. It would be reasonable to ask how many people among objectivists are happy precisely because they have a closed system at their disposal which suppresses the reevaluation of thought frameworks and provides a simple map for navigating life, rather than because that map genuinely leads to happiness through knowledge. After all, it is not uncommon to see the most intelligent people as the unhappiest. Of course, objectivists would appeal to the concept of true or sustainable happiness, which is not merely a momentary feeling, but it is clear that in doing so, we would have to accept the arbitrariness of their terminology. Thus, we are left with the conclusion that it is impossible to derive objective values from a contentious interpretation of human nature, which would then be treated as universal truth. It is important to grasp this because such an approach inevitably leads to intellectual closeness and the falsification of reality. From the perspective of objectivism, the phrase truly happy altruist must represent a paradox and an empirical impossibility, since altruism constitutes an intellectual deception and a denial of reality, and thus anti-value not based on reason, inevitably leading to unhappiness, as we previously illustrated through the character of Tuhi's niece, Cathy. In the event that we encounter a genuinely happy altruist, objectivist ideology would require primacy over empirical and lived experience, forcing us to deny their existence. Either that, or we would have to reassess the foundational premises, which in turn means ceasing to be objectivists because, as Peikoff said and Rand demonstrated, it is a closed system that cannot be altered. Returning to Kahneman and science, we can nonetheless shed light on the fact that brain scans of people who condemned unfair behavior of one stranger toward another showed increased activity in pleasure centers. This phenomenon is part of a broader occurrence called altruistic punishment and illuminates situations in which people bear real costs without clear personal gain while experiencing satisfaction or happiness. Thus, the organism signals that we are doing the right thing, which, as we noted earlier, does not guarantee correctness but relies on the objectivist logic linking pleasurable feelings to the measure of right action. Of course, Rand's expected response would be that the very act of choosing to judge or punish implies that some of our interests or values will be satisfied, even if abstract. Yet, such reasoning leads us to the same problem we have been discussing all along: the primacy of theory and debating ability over reality, as well as the potential irrefutability of objectivist claims, since any action can be interpreted as serving a purpose. It would be more accurate to say that both altruism and selfishness are terms we use to encompass aspects of evolutionary shaped behavior, assigning them particular meaning and transferring them from the realm of unconscious responses to stimuli into the realm of reflection on what is right, just, and desirable. This does not mean we are completely determined by biology, but it certainly means that we must take it into account and that altruism is not an intellectual deception, but rather a form of behavior that life develops through a process of blind groping in the dark. Just recall Teilhard de Chardin. Here is a simple example of how evolutionary heritage influences our behavior. There is no dispute that broccoli is healthier for the human body than chocolate. We arrived at this conclusion through rational consideration. However, few of us can say that broccoli tastes better or brings more pleasure than chocolate. The organism, therefore, sends us signals that are maladaptive for our survival today, when sweets are ubiquitous, but these signals were shaped by experiences of sugar scarcity, and the mechanism itself was adaptive until relatively recently in evolutionary terms. Using reason, we recognize this truth, but only after a huge number of people have died from various sugar-related illnesses. Armed with this knowledge, we can now adhere to a healthy diet, but we cannot compel the organism with our mind not to crave sugar, nor to reward us for irrational behavior. Thus, the question remains how many of us can consistently resist this. The same applies to altruism and selfishness, with one important caveat. In the realm of values, it is not so obvious which are right and which are wrong, because complex social systems do not allow the kind of dissection that medicine does, although it is most likely that both are embedded in the fabric of functional communities. BioShock offers us this raw biological impulsivity through two tracks. On the one side, we get Big Daddies as an example of pure instinctive reaction involving unconditional sacrifice for the benefit of another. Personally, I would not call them a manifestation of altruism in the philosophical sense, although they are in behavioral terms because they are conditioned beings without free will. However, the simulation of the father-daughter dynamic is not chosen randomly. Its purpose is to highlight, through the extremization of perspective, aspects of biological conditioning that cannot be reconciled with a rationalist interpretation. In this way, the game illuminates yet another test that Rand fails, as can be seen in her reflections on the questions of love or parental sacrifice for children, where she again resorts to rhetorical gymnastics in an attempt to explain them through reason and choice. Yet, although the Big Daddies do not constitute a philosophical proof of altruism, they potentially produce an interesting effect, revealing the emotional and aesthetic appeal of self-sacrifice. This is debatable as each of us reacts differently, but the question remains. How many players felt sympathy, respect, or even moral admiration for the enraged daddies, while relentlessly battling them despite the fact that they could not win? On the other hand, this raises a new question. Are moral values grounded in rational structures or in human experience? Thus, if a moral system, in this case objectivism, tells us that something we experience as touching and that many of us see as noble is actually worthless, does that lead us to question our feelings or the system that challenges them? The game leaves this to each of us. Opposing them are the splicers, as a reflection of pure, unconditional egoism and selfishness, interested in nothing beyond the gratification of their own passions. Again, they are not a manifestation of objectivist selfishness in the philosophical sense, since they are impulsive rather than rational, but they are the embodiment of selfishness in behavioral terms. Their depiction as incredibly strong and capable, yet dependent, illustrates the power of the drive for self-gratification in whatever form, even at the expense of others. And while they are not a philosophical reflection of objectivism, they reveal the repulsion we feel toward egoism. Again, everyone reacts differently, but the question remains, how many players felt hatred and hostility toward them while they greedily attack the little sisters and us, despite the fact that, like Big Daddies, they no longer have free will and are enslaved to their addictions. The dynamic between these two groups of NPCs thus serves to illuminate impulsivity, which we attempt to frame with reason as seen in the simple choice. Jack can align with either the selfish or altruistic camp by harvesting or rescuing little sisters. The essence of the choice remains the same, however much one rationalizes and justifies it with reason, and the question likewise remains for Rand. At what point can she determine whether someone is rationally or irrationally selfish, and on what basis can she deny that someone is rationally altruistic? It becomes clear once again that the intention of the creators of BioShock is not to relativize everything to absurdity, but to set a boundary on the overconfidence that arises from the idea that A equates to A. We have noted earlier that this law of identity is Aristotle's creation within the realm of logic, which Rand, and thus Ryan, adopts and transfer into the domain of metaphysical axiom. This distinction is extremely important because, in the first case, it represents a principle of correct reasoning about things without making any claims about the nature of reality itself, whereas in the second, it asserts a statement about reality as the starting point of all knowledge. Regarding Aristotle's statement, it is self-evident, leaving nothing to debate, since everything we reason about is itself. That's an example of tautology, that is, a statement that is always true. The problem with transferring such a principle into debates about reality is that it tells us essentially nothing. The statement, reality is reality, however true, contains no useful information, nor does reality require such an axiom in order to exist independently of our consciousness. Therefore, it is simply useless except when it serves to score easy points in debate, since the confidence with which one states the obvious often shapes the audience's reaction as well as self-perception. One need only look at so-called historians who claim that every civilization enters a phase of decline after reaching its peak, or so-called financial experts who tell you that stock price will fall after reaching a maximum. In terms of meaningfulness, such statements are equivalent to saying that every path you take after climbing a mountain necessarily leads downhill. Yet, observe the number of views, likes, or shares on YouTube content that goes no further than this, and you will become aware of the role such ideas play in shaping perception. For some people, the world becomes perfectly understandable and acceptable through such postulates, which is why one must repeatedly return to the distinction between understanding and knowledge offered by Professor Pillman. Another problem with transferring the law of identity into the metaphysical plane is the assumption that the way we must think about reality, that is, logic, is the same as reality itself. However, logical consistency is a tool for acquiring representations of empirical phenomena, not a reflection of them. Thus, such a statement risks conflating thought and reality. This opens all the problems we have described, which Ryan manifests. Taking one's own thoughts about reality as truth, dismissing alternative interpretations entirely, equating dissenters with evil and savagery, excessive overconfidence that blinds, and so forth. Consider, for example, the described interaction between Gravenstein and Shep. Shep decides to charge Gravenstein 10 times more for a service than others. Ryan considers this irrational, but since no principle of free choice is violated, he refuses to intervene, believing that the spontaneous order will punish Shep's irrationality. The frustration arising from the dead-end situation, which leaves no room for anything but the closure of business and bankruptcy, drives Gravenstein to kill both Shep and himself. This reaction reflects the spontaneous order, which truly costs Shep for his alleged irrationality, yet does not develop according to Ryan's expectations. On the other hand, this act is one in a series of elements that unsettle the broader population, which then adjusts its behavior to the new circumstances, increasingly dividing into camps and becoming radicalized. Thus, despite allowing into the community those who conform to his perception of rationality, Ryan disregards the truth of human behavioral variability and fluidity, expecting a mechanical and thus predictable outcome around disagreements. Here, the relevant question arises for Rand. At what point does she know that expressed selfishness is a reflection of irrationality rather than rationality? Therefore, the obvious error in reasoning, which is not a reflection of reality but an assumption about it, leads to an undesirable outcome that produces far more serious consequences than those that would have occurred had irrationality been stopped from the start. The third problem with such a metaphysical assumption arises from its inconsistency with teachings of modern physics. Since I am not sufficiently versed in this field, what follows should be taken with a grain of salt. From the perspective of quantum physics, considering the phenomenon of superposition, we arrive at the idea that a particle can exist in multiple states simultaneously until we measure it. This is very confusing, yet it stands in opposition to the metaphysics of A equates to A. While Rand assumes absolute existence independent of the observer, quantum superposition points to indefinite existence until the moment of measurement, meaning that things at the quantum level do not have a fully defined identity until we observe them. For me, this problem remains epistemological, not metaphysical. But even if this means that I don't believe that our consciousness somehow shapes reality, it forces us to rethink what identity actually represents. This fluidity of identity is not just a problem of physics, it is primarily a sociological issue. The question of the cross-section is what poses a problem in determining the identity of communities and individuals. For Rapture is Rapture, but Rapture at its birth is not the Rapture that Jack enters. Depending on which segment of its being we measure, we can observe both excellence and injustice, both rational selfishness and altruistic empathy. This is true for any society. The same applies to Ryan, who at first demonstrates vision, strength of character, and the ability to provide opportunity to exceptional people, but ends as a paranoid tyrant, judging the neutral by using black and white principle. There is no doubt that it is the same person, but his character is not given and unchangeable. It is dynamic, leaving us with the question of where this dynamism comes from. This reflects Heraclitus' idea of the flow, which changes identity. We cannot step into the same river twice. The category itself does not change, so the river does not become a non-river, but our relationship to it changes. Thus, although we once bathed in clear water, I don't believe we would enter the same river if it became poisoned over time. What then prevents Galt's or Ryan's utopia from rotting? The BioShock logo bears witness to this flow, leading, as we said, from the hope of dawn, through the brilliance of noon, to the dilapidated twilight, all in hurried motion. That potential lies within each of us. We can also reflect on the dynamic between Ryan and Lamb as a reflection of social dynamics in general. The emergence of B, which influences reality by shaping it, that is Ryan, produces an anti-B as a force pulling in the opposite direction, later embodied by someone else, that is Lamb, so that Rapture arises as an A created by Ryan, but in the collision of these forces it takes on another form. Thus, A is A, but A is a function of B and anti-B. Consequently, identity depends on the moment of observation, on cross-section, so the answer to what Rapture is depends on when we observe it, echoing Heraclitus, but also Hegel's idea of identity through contradictions and development. In the example of the underwater utopia, we see an additional complication arising from Ryan's character. Concerned about the audience's reaction to Sofia Lamb's speech, Ryan decides to arrest her, only pouring more fuel on the fire and opening the way for an even greater opposition, namely Atlas. For Lamb was attempting to win through reasoned debate, unlike Atlas, who does so through force. The system produces its own contradiction and deepens it. In this way, A is not only A, but becomes A in process. May we then ask whether and at what moment does Rapture cease to be Rapture, as A of Ryan's utopia over time becomes the anti-A of Sofia's utopia. We can say that identity remains, but the content of that identity changes. Rapture remains Rapture, even while embodying opposing forces. On the other hand, both Ryan and Lamb, in their attempts to create utopias, produce anti-utopias. From an external perspective, therefore, they are part of the same category, ideologues who prioritize their own imaginings of reality. Thus, they are A and A prime, yet if the outcome of both is ruin, death, arbitrary will, and decay, is that difference truly significant? These are very complex questions which cannot be reduced to simple categories. We have already mentioned in Stalker the flow of atoms and cells through the course of existence, which raises the relevant question of what we actually are if every unit of the building blocks of our being changes over time. The game shows us this through plastic surgery and shifting standards of beauty, through plasmids and mutable abilities, through exceptional people and changes of character. Can we then say that our struggles, deaths, survival, feats, ideas, suffering, and joys are meaningful or meaningless because humanity remains humanity no matter what color we paint it and no matter which people make it? I have no answers to such questions, but I am skeptical of those whose systems claim to explain everything. Yet, looking at Rapture once again after all we have outlined, we can say that ultimately this city fulfills what the great man at the entrance promises. Despite its splendor, exceptionalism, achievements, grandeur, and even superhuman capacities, in its halls and chambers we find neither kings nor gods. There is only man the way he is, complicated. Here, a closed system like that of Ayn Rand's or of any other person, which prescribes what man should be, does not help us in understanding, but rather enslaves or kills our intellectual capacities. In the end, what separates a philosopher from an ideologue? Reason? Ideas? No. A philosopher questions, an ideologue declares. Thank you for watching.